Hook the night is quiet, the world's slowing down. Imagine yourself sinking into soft sheets, the faint glow of a lamp flickering on the wall. Outside, time drifts like a slow river. Tonight we are going back 100 years to an age of jazz, silent films, and whispered laughter in dimly lit rooms. The Roaring Twenties, an era that danced on the edge of modernity, yet lived with a kind of innocence that feels distant now. It was a time when the world had just come out of a devastating war, when ordinary people, tired of struggle, looked toward leisure as a new form of freedom. As you close your eyes, let me tell you how Americans really spent their free time in those restless, glittering, and strangely calm years. Part 1, Daily Life in the 1920s. The story begins on an ordinary afternoon in 1923. Picture a small American town, its streets lined with brick shops and wide sidewalks. The air carries the scent of fresh bread from the bakery, mingling with the sharp tang of gasoline from a passing automobile. Life is not yet fast, but it is no longer slow. Men in hats stroll home from work, their jackets loosened, while women with bobbed hair linger outside department store windows, admiring displays of silk dresses and polished shoes. Daily life in the 1920s had a rhythm of its own, somewhere between the old world and the new. The Great War had ended only a few years earlier, leaving behind a population that longed for joy. Families, weary from sacrifice, embraced the small pleasures of everyday living. Warm. Free time was suddenly more than just a pause between work and sleep. It became an escape, a way to live fully in a decade that promised prosperity. In the evenings, neighborhoods were alive with the chatter of families gathered on porches. Children played marbles on dusty sidewalks, while their parents sipped coffee or lemonade and exchanged quiet words with neighbors. Life felt safer, more open, and yet beneath it all there was an excitement, a restlessness, a desire to enjoy every moment before it slipped away. For many, leisure was tied to simple rituals. Reading the daily newspaper was not only a habit, but an act of participation in a larger world. Radios were beginning to hum in some homes, though not everywhere yet, and the voices of announcers carried news, music, and entertainment into living rooms where once only silence had reigned. Families would gather around, listening with a mixture of awe and comfort, their imaginations filling in the spaces between words. Sundays were special. In towns across America, the morning church bells signaled not just worship, but also a kind of communal rhythm. After services, families strolled through parks, mothers carrying parasols while fathers pushed strollers or held the hands of small children. Ice cream parlors became sanctuaries of delight, their tiled floors echoing with the laughter of young couples sharing Sundays. Free time in this world was not about grand gestures. It was about savouring moments of peace. Yet the 1920s were not just about quiet evenings and small-town walks. They were also about the arrival of modern conveniences that freed people from the burdens of constant labour. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and better stoves transformed the daily workload of women, giving them hours once swallowed by chores. With more time, there came more possibility. The idea of leisure began to spread, touching every corner of society. At dusk, the streets changed their tone. In big cities, lights began to glow from cafes, dance halls, and theatres. But in smaller towns, evenings were still modest. Gatherings on front steps, children's games fading into the sound of crickets, and the glow of kerosene lamps or the newer electric bulbs inside warm kitchens. A sense of calm, mixed with anticipation, filled the air. The decade was called a roaring, but not everyone experienced it with noise and excess. For most Americans, free time was a gentle luxury, a walk to the park, a slow conversation, a chance to hear a song on the phonograph, Nick-graph. It was in these moments that the spirit of the 1920s lived quietly, shaping memories that would linger long after the glitter of the decade faded. The story begins on an ordinary afternoon in 1923. Picture a small American town, its streets lined with brick shops and wide sidewalks. The air carries the scent of fresh bread from the bakery, mingling with the sharp tang of gasoline from a passing automobile. Life is not yet fast, but it is no longer slow. Men in hats stroll home from work, their jackets loosened, while women with bobbed hair linger outside department store windows, admiring displays of silk dresses and polished shoes. Daily life in the 1920s had a rhythm of its own, somewhere between the old world and the new. The Great War had ended only a few years earlier, leaving behind a population that longed for joy. Families, weary from sacrifice, embraced the small pleasures of everyday living. Free time was suddenly more than just a pause between work and sleep. It became an escape, a way to live fully in a decade that promised prosperity. In the evenings, neighbourhoods were alive with the chatter of families gathered on porches. Children played marbles on dusty sidewalks, while their parents sipped coffee or lemonade and exchanged quiet words with neighbours. Life felt safer, more open, and yet beneath it all there was an excitement, a restlessness, a desire to enjoy every moment before it slipped away. For many, leisure was tied to simple rituals. Reading the daily newspaper was not only a habit, but an act of participation in a larger world. Radios were beginning to hum in some homes, though not everywhere yet, and the voices of announcers carried news, music, and entertainment into living rooms where once only silence had reigned. Families would gather around, listening with a mixture of awe and comfort, their imaginations filling in the spaces between words. Sundays were special. In towns across America, the morning church bells signaled not just worship, but also a kind of communal rhythm. After services, families strolled through parks, mothers carrying parasols while fathers pushed strollers or held the hands of small children. Ice cream parlours became sanctuaries of delight, their tiled floors echoing with the laughter of young couples sharing Sundays. Free time, in this world, was not about grand gestures. It was about savouring moments of peace. Yet the 1920s were not just about quiet evenings and small-town walks. They were also about the arrival of modern conveniences that freed people from the burdens of constant labour. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and better stoves transformed the daily workload of women, giving them hours once swallowed by chores. With more time, there came more possibility. The idea of leisure began to spread, touching every corner of society. At dusk, the streets changed their tone. In big cities, lights began to glow from cafes, dance halls, and theatres. But in smaller towns, evenings were still modest. Gatherings on front steps, children's games fading into the sound of crickets and the glow of kerosene lamps or the newer electric bulbs inside warm kitchens. A sense of calm, mixed with anticipation, filled the air. The decade was called a roaring, but not everyone experienced it with noise and excess. For most Americans, free time was a gentle luxury, a walk to the park, a slow conversation, a chance to hear a song on the phonograph. It was in these moments that the spirit of the 1920s lived quietly, shaping memories that would linger long after the glitter of the decade faded. The sense of time itself felt different then. Without the constant buzz of screens and alerts, moments stretched longer. An hour on the porch felt full, a walk to the corner store an outing worth remembering. People lived closer to the rhythm of the sun. Mornings opened with the smell of breakfast drifting through kitchens, afternoons with the rustle of newspapers and footsteps on sidewalks, and evenings with the soft murmur of radios or the crackling of a phonograph needle. Families cherished this cadence. After supper, children might be sent out to play for a final half hour before bed. The street would fill with games of tag, jump rope, or stickball, while parents leaned on railings and exchanged gossip about local happenings. The glow of street lamps gave the whole scene a gentle shimmer, as though every night were its own kind of celebration. For many families, this was leisure, simple, familiar, and endlessly comforting. In the countryside, free time carried a different texture. Farms demanded hard labour, and leisure came in smaller doses. A farmer might spend his rare, quiet hours whittling wood on the porch, while his wife quilted by the window. Children in rural homes made their own fun with homemade toys, chasing chickens in the yard, or reading dime novels by the fire. The pace was slower, yet no less meaningful. Leisure in the 1920s was not defined by extravagance, but by the space it allowed for connection, with family, with neighbours, with the quiet pulse of everyday life. The younger generation, however, felt the stirrings of something different. Young men and women, particularly those in towns and cities, sought more than just the familiar rhythms of their parents. They wanted music, movement, laughter. They wanted the sensation of a world in motion. For them, leisure meant stepping out, walking into the glow of theatres, into the sound of pianos in smoky bars, into the electric hum of a society inventing itself anew. But in those early years of the decade, before the jazz age truly swept the nation, leisure was still caught between two worlds. the old traditions of family, scented evenings, and the emerging promise of entertainment that reached beyond the home. Both coexisted, weaving together a picture of a nation learning to relax in new ways. There was also the influence of work itself. The average American worker, depending on occupation, was beginning to enjoy shorter work hours than generations before. The concept of the weekend gained stronger footing during the 1920s. Factories, offices, and shops closed on Saturdays, freeing 2 whole days for rest and play. This shift created opportunities for family outings, sports games, and drives into the countryside. Leisure was no longer just for the wealthy. It belonged increasingly to everyone. In small towns, one might find leisure in community gatherings. Barn dances, fairs, and picnics brought neighbours together, turning free time into shared time. The sound of fiddles filled barns lit with lanterns, and the laughter of families echoed across fields at summer picnics. Evenings could be spent listening to local bands in the town square, or simply watching the world go by from a favourite bench. In cities, the picture grew livelier. Cafes welcomed groups of friends who lingered for hours over cups of coffee or glasses of soda. Bookshops invited quiet readers, while department stores became social destinations in their own right. Simply browsing through polished aisles filled with the latest fashions was considered a form of leisure, a chance to dream of a more stylish life. The automobile changed everything. With a car, even modest families could transform their free time. A drive through the countryside, a picnic by a river, or an evening visit to relatives miles away became accessible in ways that had once seemed impossible. Roads became lines of freedom, and the open landscape called to those who wished to escape the limits of their own neighbourhoods. For young couples, the car offered privacy, a space where time itself seemed to pause. Still, not every home owned an automobile, and not every town had the bustle of a cafe or theatre. For many, the phonograph was the centerpiece of leisure. Winding up the machine and placing the needle on a record carried a ritualistic magic. Music filled the room, turning ordinary evenings into small celebrations. Families would sit together, listening in silence, swaying gently, their minds carried far from their daily routines. Even in these quiet moments, there was a sense that something larger was stirring. The world was modernizing, and leisure was becoming part of that change. The notion that one could choose how to spend time, that free hours were not merely left to chance but could be shaped into experiences. This was new. It gave life a dimension that previous generations, bound by endless labour, could scarcely imagine. The 1920s were not just about the thrill of excess, as history often paints them. They were about this delicate shift from survival to living, from work to leisure, from necessity to choice. Free time became a canvas, and Americans began to paint on it with everything they had: laughter, conversation, music, games and dreams. And as the sun set on those small towns and growing cities, and as lamps flickered on across porches and streets, a gentle truth lingered. Leisure in the 1920s was not always loud or extravagant. Often it was as simple as a quiet evening shared with others, the sound of a record spinning, or the laughter of children fading into the warm night air. On summer evenings, the sound of laughter often drifted through open windows. Families gathered around kitchen tables for board games that were simple but beloved. Checkers, dominoes, and card games filled the hours with gentle competition. Children learned patience as they shuffled worn decks of cards, their parents smiling quietly at their eagerness. Games like these carried no noise, no great spectacle, but they created memories stitched together by the calm rhythm of family life. In towns where electricity was becoming common, light itself transformed leisure. Instead of retiring early with the setting sun, families could stay awake longer, bathed in the warm glow of bulbs that hummed faintly overhead. Reading in the evening became a new luxury. Novels, magazines, and serial stories captivated readers who now had the time and light to enjoy them. In this way, free time expanded not only in hours but in possibility. Magazines carried pictures of glamorous movie stars, elegant fashions, and modern inventions. Even if readers could not afford such luxuries, they could imagine them, slipping briefly into lives that seemed larger than their own. This act of imagining was itself a form of leisure, a way to stretch beyond the boundaries of one's town or household. Children too found joy in their leisure hours. Without television or electronic distractions, play unfolded in open yards, alleys, and empty lots. They built makeshift forts, chased hoops down dirt roads, or played hide and seek until the stars appeared overhead. Laughter echoed through neighbourhoods, a reminder that leisure did not always need objects or money, only time, space, and companionship. In small towns, the local library became a sanctuary for quiet leisure. Rows of books offered worlds beyond the horizon, and the hushed stillness of reading rooms gave a sense of escape. Students, dreamers, and weary workers alike found comfort in those pages. The simple act of turning a page could carry one across oceans into history or into imagined futures. In an age before endless distractions, the written word held its own kind of magic. The texture of leisure also shifted with the seasons. In summer, picnics were a cherished ritual and joy. Families packed baskets with sandwiches, fruit, and jars of lemonade, then spread blankets under the shade of tall trees. Children waded in creeks, while parents leaned back to watch clouds drift lazily overhead. Evenings brought fireflies, captured briefly in glass jars before being set free again. Free time in summer seemed endless, like the stretch of a golden afternoon. Winter leisure was quieter, wrapped in warmth and light. Families gathered close around stoves, the crackle of firewood blending with the sounds of conversation. Quilts spread across laps, books open in hands, and knitting needles clicked steadily as hours passed. Board games returned, accompanied by mugs of hot cocoa or tea. Outside, the world might be cold and still, but inside, leisure was warm, enclosed, and shared. The changing decade also brought new ways to socialise. For young people, dances became a highlight of free time, though we often think of the jazz-filled dance halls of the later 20s. Even in the early years, local gatherings were lively. Community centres, barns, and schools hosted evenings where fiddles or pianos kept the music going. Girls in modest dresses twirled beneath string lights, while boys shuffled nervously before joining the floor. Leisure was not simply rest, it was the creation of bonds, friendships, and sometimes love. Technology, subtle as it was in those early years, shaped free time in unexpected ways. The telephone, still spreading in many areas, made leisure more social. Friends could arrange to meet at the park, families could plan visits more easily, and news of local events travelled faster. The telephone's ring became a symbol of connection, drawing people out of solitude and into shared moments. In larger households, leisure sometimes overlapped with responsibility. Older children helped watch younger siblings, but they turned this duty into play. A story read aloud to a toddler became entertainment for the reader as well. Rocking a baby to sleep by lamplight gave older siblings a chance to hum their favourite tunes. Even chores could be softened by the spirit of leisure, as long as they were shared. Leisure in the 1920s carried another important thread: community identity. In both towns and cities, people gathered not only as families but as neighbours. The local baseball game, the church picnic, the town parade, all of these events were forms of collective leisure. They reminded individuals that they were part of something larger, something woven together by shared traditions and simple pleasures. The town square was often the stage for such leisure. On summer evenings, benches filled with men exchanging news, women strolling arm in arm, and children darting between the crowd. Bands sometimes played in gazebos, filling the night air with music that softened the edges of daily life. Couples walked slowly, conversations lingering as they passed familiar storefronts. Time seemed to stretch differently in such places, where every face was known and every gesture felt part of the community's rhythm. Yet even as leisure carried this communal quality, there was an undercurrent of change. The younger generation, shaped by the new pace of technology and culture, sought freer, more independent ways of spending time. Automobiles carried them beyond the borders of small towns. Phonographs gave them music their parents found strange. Dance steps quickened, fashion shortened, and with each shift, leisure took on a bolder, more adventurous form. Still, at its heart, the 1920s preserved the idea that leisure was essential to life. Whether through a quiet evening by the fire, a lively game in the street, or a slow walk through the town square, free time gave shape to existence. It was not wasted time, but cherished time. The hours that made work meaningful and family bonds strong. As the decade unfolded, these patterns deepened, setting the stage for even greater changes. The rise of jazz, the glamour of movies, the thrill of sports, all would soon sweep across America, reshaping leisure into something louder, faster, and more colourful. But in these early years of the 1920s, before the roar grew too loud, free time remained grounded in simple joys. It was the quiet hum beneath the surface of daily life, steady and reassuring, carrying families gently through the days. And so, in kitchens, on porches, in parks, and along the sidewalks of small towns and bustling cities alike, the story of leisure in the roaring 20s began not with extravagance, but with simplicity. It began with the recognition that time could be more than labour, that hours could be filled not only with tasks but with laughter, music, and rest. In this recognition lay the true spirit of the decade, a spirit that would soon grow, flourish and roar. The world outside was shifting quickly, but for ordinary families, leisure remained a thread woven through everyday life. The simplicity of free time gave stability in an age of rapid change. After long workdays in factories, offices or shops, evenings became a bomb, a gentle pause before the cycle began again. For many, this pause meant gathering not only with family, but also with neighbours. The idea of visiting was itself a leisure activity. A knock at the door, a familiar voice calling out from the porch. Such moments were treasured. Friends came bearing pies or baskets of fruit, and evenings unfolded over coffee, conversation, and shared laughter. Without the distractions of later decades, leisure was rooted in presence. People gave one another their full attention, and in this attentive companionship, hours passed unnoticed. Children's leisure blended seamlessly with learning. Storytelling was one of the oldest forms of evening entertainment. Parents and grandparents passed down tales from memory, shaping imaginations as children leaned closer, eyes wide in lamplight. Sometimes the stories were of local history, sometimes of distant lands, and sometimes of mischievous characters meant to teach lessons. For children, this was more thrilling than any silent film, for the voices of their elders carried love within every word. Even meals were part of leisure in the 1920s. Families often lingered at the table long after the food was gone, savouring conversation as much as the meal. Dinner was not rushed, but stretched gently, with stories of the day and plans for the weekend. Some families sang together after meals, their voices mingling in hymns or folk songs. The act of sharing food and song turned ordinary evenings into memory-laden rituals. In larger cities, leisure acquired more layers. The hum of traffic, the glow of electric lights, the chatter of crowded sidewalks, these all shaped how people experienced free time. Strolling through department stores became a pastime in itself, even without purchases. Window displays, carefully crafted with mannequins in elegant attire or glittering jewellery, drew crowds who admired them as though they were theatre performances. For urban dwellers, leisure was often about watching, absorbing the spectacle of modern life unfolding all around. Street performers added another layer to city leisure. Musicians, magicians, and entertainers claimed corners and sidewalks, offering passers-by a few minutes of delight. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves to stop and listen, while young couples lingered, smiling at the novelty. These spontaneous encounters filled free time with unpredictability and joy. In small towns, entertainment could be quieter but no less meaningful. Community plays, often held in school auditoriums or church halls, brought together amateur actors and eager audiences. Though the performances were simple, the laughter and applause filled the rooms with warmth. For those who lived far from the glamour of big cities, such events were cherished highlights of leisure life. The presence of prohibition shaped leisure, even in these early years. While the sale of alcohol was illegal, gatherings did not vanish. In fact, they often grew more creative. In cities, hidden bars and speakeasies became destinations for those seeking a livelier form of leisure. But in small towns, the response was quieter. Families hosted more dinners at home, turning the absence of drink into an opportunity for stronger conversation, for music played on pianos, for games that stretched late into the evening. Leisure adapted, finding ways to thrive within boundaries. The rhythm of leisure was also tied to the natural world. Without constant artificial distractions, people listened more closely to the changing seasons. Spring brought Sunday walks among blooming trees, summer brought long evenings under starlit skies, autumn invited harvest festivals and fairs, and winter drew families inward for cosy nights. Free time was never separate from the turning of the year, was braided into nature's cycles, reminding people of their place within a larger world. One can imagine a single day in 1925, a Saturday in early autumn. Morning chores end, and by afternoon the family piles into a modest car. They drive out of town along dusty roads, the landscape opening into fields coloured gold and red by the season. The children laugh in the back seat, while the parents breathe deeply, enjoying the simple thrill of movement. At the park, a blanket is spread, sandwiches unwrapped, and hours are spent watching clouds drift and leaves fall. As the sun lowers, they return home, the day etched into memory as a perfect use of free time. Not every leisure hour was joyous, of course. Some found solitude in their free time, preferring the quiet company of thought. Men might sit on porches with pipes, staring at the horizon. Women might keep journals, writing reflections by lamplight. For some, leisure was about retreating from noise, carving space for the self in a world that demanded constant giving. These quiet acts of reflection were just as much a part of the 1920s as the lively dances and bustling theatres. And so, leisure in this decade was both shared and solitary, lively and calm, public and private. It stretched across the spectrum of human need: connection, imagination, rest and joy. In the softness of evenings, in the laughter of children, in the glow of street lamps, in the pages of books, in the hum of phonographs, and in the conversations that wound late into the night, free time carried the pulse of the roaring 20s. This was the beginning of a cultural shift. A nation that had once measured time in work and duty began to see value in leisure itself. Free time was no longer wasted time. It was life lived fully, moments claimed for pleasure, creativity and connection. And though louder, flashier forms of entertainment would soon rise, jazz clubs, movie palaces, baseball stadiums, the foundation of leisure in the 1920s was built first on these quiet, ordinary evenings. As the decade unfolded, leisure would roar, just as history remembers. But before the noise there was calm. Before the glamour, there was simplicity. Before the spectacle, there was the quiet joy of daily life, lived slowly and shared deeply. That is how Americans truly spent their free time in the earliest years of the Roaring Twenties, in ways that were tender, modest, and profoundly human. It begins with a sound, a low note, warm and steady, slipping out from the brass of a trumpet. Then comes the shuffle of a drum, soft at first, then sharper, until it begins to pulse like a heartbeat. A piano joins in, its keys rippling through the air like drops of water, and suddenly the room is alive. This was the new sound of America in the 1920s. Jazz, restless yet soothing, bold yet playful. A music that seemed to breathe with the times. To understand how people spent their free time in the Roaring Twenties, one cannot overlook music. It was everywhere, from quiet phonographs in small-town parlours to crowded clubs in New York and Chicago. Music was not just entertainment, it was a mirror of the age, carrying within it the joy, the rebellion, and the hunger for something fresh. The roots of this sound reached back farther than the decade itself. Jazz was born from a blending of traditions: African rhythms, blues from the Mississippi Delta, ragtime with its syncopated bounce. It carried the voices of black communities in New Orleans, where horns, drums, and voices mingled in parades and dance halls. By the time the 1920s opened, jazz had already begun to travel, carried by musicians who left Louisiana for the promise of northern cities. In the movement of people, the music moved too, gathering strength, adapting, and spreading into the heart of American leisure. For ordinary Americans, music offered an escape. After long days of work, after years of war, the sound of jazz felt like fresh air. It was unpredictable, alive with improvisation, never the same twice. In a world that had once felt rigid and burdened by tradition, jazz opened doors to freedom. To sit in a club and hear a horn solo stretch into the night was to feel, for a moment, that life itself could be improvised. Dance became the natural companion to this new sound. The Charleston, the Foxtrot, the Black Bottom, these dances swept across the country like a fever. Young men and women filled dance halls, their bodies moving with a freedom that startled their parents. Skirts lifted, heels tapped, and arms swung wide. The dances were fast, playful, and daring. In every step was a declaration. Leisure was no longer about restraint, but about release. Not everyone approved. Older generations sometimes frowned at the music, calling it noisy, even immoral. Ministers preached against the sway of jazz, warning that it led to reckless behavior. But such warnings only made the music more alluring. To dance to jazz in the 1920s was to feel part of something modern, something bold, something that belonged entirely to the present. Phonographs brought this energy into homes. Families gathered around, winding the machine, placing the needle, and letting the music spill out into their parlours. Though the sound was scratchy, it carried magic. Young people taught their parents the steps, and laughter filled living rooms as families attempted the Charleston together. Music was not confined to clubs. It seeped into every corner of American life. Radios expanded its reach even further. By the mid-1920s, radio stations were broadcasting music across the nation. Suddenly, a family in a quiet farming town could hear the same songs as those playing in New York dance halls. The shared experience connected Americans in ways that had never been possible before. Music no longer belonged only to cities, it belonged to everyone, everywhere. In cities, nightlife revolved around the pulse of jazz. Harlem in New York became a center of this cultural explosion. Clubs like the Cotton Club and the Savoy Ballroom drew crowds eager to hear the latest bands. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, their names carried power, their music carried joy. The clubs themselves glittered with lights, filled with the scent of smoke and perfume, alive with movement until the early hours of morning. Leisure in such spaces was intoxicating, both literally and figuratively. Speakeasies added another layer to this musical world. Hidden behind unmarked doors, often reached by whispered passwords, these illegal bars thrived under prohibition. Inside, people found not just alcohol but music, laughter, and a sense of rebellion. The very act of being there was a form of leisure, daring, secretive, thrilling. The music in Speakeasies carried this edge, its rhythms sharper, its improvisations wilder. Patrons danced not only to the beat of the band but to the thrill of defiance. In smaller towns, the experience was gentler but no less meaningful. Local bands played at community dances, bringing jazz and blues into school gyms or town halls. Young musicians imitated what they had heard on records, blending it with their own traditions. Couples filled the floor, moving in patterns that echoed the larger currents of culture. Even without the glitter of Harlem or Chicago, music shaped leisure in profound ways. The power of this music was not only in its sound, but in its symbolism. Jazz represented change. It represented the breaking of old boundaries and the creation of something new. For women, especially young women known as flappers, jazz was the soundtrack of freedom. They cut their hair short, wore dresses that allowed movement, and stepped into dance halls without chaperones. In the rhythm of jazz, they found a new kind of independence, one that shocked older generations but thrilled their peers. For African American communities, jazz was both art and affirmation. Though segregation limited opportunities, the music carried pride and creativity across boundaries. Black musicians became central figures in shaping leisure for all Americans, even as they faced discrimination. In this contradiction, widespread admiration alongside systemic exclusion lay one of the complex truths of the 1920s. Leisure, like the nation itself, was both liberating and divided. Still, the joy of music transcended barriers. A song played in Harlem could echo in a farmhouse in Kansas. A rhythm born in New Orleans could set dancers spinning in Chicago. Leisure in the 1920s was not just about how people spent their hours. It was about how those hours were filled with a sound that seemed to belong to the future. The decade's nickname, the Ajaz Ager, was no accident. Music defined the mood of the time. It was restless, daring, full of possibility. Sound full of possibility. It was also tender, capable of carrying sorrow in the notes of a blues song or longing in the slow rise of a trumpet's melody. Leisure in this age was as much about listening as it was about moving. Couples swayed slowly to ballads, friends sang along to choruses, and solitary listeners found comfort in the scratch of a record spinning in the dark. Night after night, music offered release. It was not merely background. It was the heartbeat of leisure, the pulse of the roaring 20s itself. The dance halls of the 1920s were more than just places to move to music. They were stages where society rehearsed a new way of living. Imagine stepping into one on a Saturday night. The doors open, and the sound hits you first. A lively band up front, horns gleaming under soft lights, the piano's keys dancing as quickly as the people. The floor is alive, crowded with young men and women moving in syncopated rhythm. The scent of sweat, perfume and cigarette smoke mingles with the brassy sound of trumpets. Every beat of the drum feels like an invitation. This is where leisure comes alive. Dance halls were affordable, and that was key. For just a small fee, nearly anyone could step inside and join the fun. The working-class clerk, The factory labourer, the typist, they all came here after long days and long weeks seeking escape. The democratic spirit of the dance floor was part of its charm. You did not need wealth to move your feet to the Charleston. You only needed the courage to join the crowd. The dances themselves carried layers of meaning. The Charleston, with its fast kicks and swinging arms, symbolised youthful rebellion. The foxtrot, smoother and more graceful, reflected a blend of old elegance with new daring. The black bottom, born from African-American culture, brought playful humour to the floor with its exaggerated moves. Together, these dances told the story of a nation shaking off stiffness and finding joy in freedom of movement. Parents often worried to see their sons and daughters pressed close on the dance floor, moving quickly, sometimes wildly, felt improper. Some believed the dances were indecent, too suggestive, too modern. Newspapers occasionally ran complaints from community leaders urging stricter supervision. But young people rarely listened. The thrill of dancing to live jazz was too strong to be silenced by scolding. Leisure in the 1920s was becoming youth-centred, and nowhere was this clearer than in the dance hall. And then there were the speakeasies, places that combined music, dance, and defiance into a single experience. Prohibition, meant to eliminate alcohol, instead created an underground world of hidden bars and secret clubs. To enter a speakeasy was to step into a small rebellion against authority. People whispered passwords, knocked on unmarked doors, and slipped into rooms that pulsed with energy. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Glasses clinked, conversations hummed, and bands played with fire. Jazz seemed especially suited to these secret spaces, its improvisations echoing the improvisational nature of the evening itself. Nothing was certain in a speakeasy, not the safety of staying there, not the permanence of the bar itself, not even the next note from the trumpet. That uncertainty made it thrilling. For many Americans, this was leisure at its most intoxicating, dangerous, playful, and alive. Not everyone who entered a speakeasy was there for the alcohol. For many, it was the music that drew them in. Speakeasies became stages for rising musicians, places where new sounds could be tested and perfected. The audiences were eager, often forgiving, and always ready to be carried away by rhythm. Musicians, in turn, thrived on this energy, pushing boundaries, experimenting with tempos, and finding new ways to keep the room moving. The speakeasy blurred lines of class and identity. Wealthy patrons sometimes sat beside working-class ones. Men and women mingled freely. In some cities, though segregation remained, speakeasies were among the rare places where races mixed, if only briefly and imperfectly, through the common language of music. Leisure here was a small taste of equality, though fleeting and fragile. Beyond the physical spaces of dance halls and speakeasies, radio reshaped the entire landscape of leisure. By the early 1920s, radio ownership was spreading rapidly. Families saved to buy sets, marvelling at the strange wooden boxes that could capture voices and music from miles away. It was as if the air itself had become alive with entertainment. Evenings began to change. Instead of relying on local gatherings for amusement, people could now sit in their living rooms and be connected to distant performances. Bands played live on the air, their music reaching across farmland and cities alike. Suddenly, leisure was no longer limited by geography. A farmer in Nebraska could tap his foot to the same jazz tune that a banker in Boston enjoyed. The intimacy of radio made it especially powerful. Unlike dance halls or speakeasies, radio reached into private spaces. Families gathered around, children on the floor, parents leaning back, all listening together. The glow of the radio dial cast a soft light in dark rooms, a symbol of the modern age. Programs introduced new songs, which quickly became national hits. In this way, radio created shared experiences on a scale America had never seen. It also changed the business of music. Record sales soared as people wanted to own the songs they heard over the air. Musicians gained fame not only from live performances but from radio play, their names becoming familiar in households across the country. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Bessie Smith were not just performers in distant cities. They were voices in the homes of millions. Leisure, once local, had become national. For many, the beauty of radio was its balance between excitement and comfort. Dance halls and speakeasies were thrilling but sometimes exhausting, even risky. Radio, by contrast, offered a safe, cosy form of leisure. One could enjoy jazz without leaving home, without spending much, without fear of police raids. Yet the sense of connection, of belonging to the same cultural moment as millions of others, was just as strong. The rise of radio also gave birth to a new kind of shared ritual. Families planned their evenings around broadcasts. They adjusted antennas, fine-tuned dials, and sat together in anticipation. When a favourite programme began, it was like the curtain lifting on a stage, except this stage existed in the imagination. Music filled the air, and the living room became a theatre. Still, for all the comfort of radio, the law of live music remained. There was something irreplaceable about the energy of a crowded dance hall or a smoky speakeasy. The sound of feet on wood, the laughter between songs, the glances exchanged under dim light, these were experiences that no radio could replicate. Many Americans moved fluidly between these worlds, enjoying quiet nights with radio at home and wild nights of dancing in public. Together, they formed the rhythm of leisure in the 1920s. As the decade moved forward, the technology of radio improved. Broadcasts became clearer and programming more varied. News, comedy and storytelling joined music, creating a complete world of sound. But through it all, music remained the heart of the medium. It was what drew people to buy radios, what kept them listening, what gave them joy after long days. The combination of dance halls, speakeasies and radio created a kind of triangle of leisure. Each space offered something different: the social thrill of public dancing, the daring secrecy of underground drinking and jazz, the quiet intimacy of family listening. Together, they reflected the complexity of American life in the roaring 20s. Leisure was not one thing, but many, woven together by the thread of music. And within that music was the spirit of the age, restless, playful, daring, sometimes reckless, but always alive. To hear jazz in the 1920s was to feel the future rushing toward you, unpredictable and exciting. To dance, to listen, to hum along. These were not small pastimes. They were the heartbeat of a decade that defined itself by how it played. Music in the 1920s was not only entertainment, it was a teacher, a companion, and a silent partner in people's private lives. When Americans danced, they danced to jazz. When they gathered in parlours, they listened to records or radio songs. When they slipped into speakeasies, it was the rhythm of a band that covered the clinking of glasses. Leisure was stitched into melody, and melody became the soul of the decade. And what is remarkable is how quickly the music spread and how deeply it influenced ordinary habits. In towns where no dance hall existed, young people invented spaces of their own. A cleared barn floor became a stage. A school gym, after lessons ended, transformed into a place of rhythm. Neighbours brought food, and someone with a phonograph supplied records, and someone with a phonograph supplied records. Even far from Harlem or Chicago, the leisure of music connected people in shared joy. In cities, the story was louder and brighter. New York's Harlem became a centre not only of music but of cultural pride. The Harlem Renaissance brought writers, artists, and musicians together, creating a wave of creativity that reshaped American identity. At night, the music from clubs like the Cotton Club floated out into the streets, luring crowds of listeners who could not afford the price of admission. The sound was enough. Music free in the air belonged to everyone who paused to listen. Chicago, too, pulsed with rhythm. Migrants from the South brought jazz and blues northward, filling neighborhoods with sound. Clubs lined the streets, offering bands that played into dawn. For workers who had endured long hours in factories or stockyards, such nights were more than leisure. They were a taste of freedom, a reminder that life was not only toil. Hollywood even began to borrow from this musical energy. Silent films sometimes featured live musicians in theatres, adding jazz rhythms to chase scenes or comic moments. Movie palaces echoed with laughter and the syncopated beat of drums. Though film had not yet learned to speak, it had already learned to dance. Perhaps the most intimate influence of music came in private moments. A young woman practicing dance steps alone in her room, repeating the Charleston until her shoes scuffed. A couple sitting side by side near the phonograph, their hands brushing as a blues song poured through the needle. A tired worker, head against the radio, finding comfort in a familiar melody. Leisure in the 1920s was not only public display, it was also these quiet encounters with sound, moments of rest and imagination. The way people dressed also changed under the influence of music. Shorter skirts allowed women to move freely on the dance floor. Men's suits became looser, designed for both style and motion. Fashion no longer bowed only to formality, it bent to rhythm. Even clothes became part of leisure, shaped by the demands of dance. The social meaning of music reached beyond fun. For women, especially flappers, it became a soundtrack to independence. To cut one's hair short, to smoke in public, to dance unchaperoned, these were bold choices, and jazz carried them forward. Leisure became a declaration of identity, each step on the dance floor a small act of freedom. For African-American musicians, jazz was a source of both opportunity and challenge. Their talents brought fame, yet segregation often denied them equal treatment. Some clubs, like the Cotton Club, allowed black performers, but barred black audiences. The contradiction was sharp. The music that defined American leisure came from black creativity, yet racial barriers persisted. Still, the musicians played, and in their playing, they reshaped culture. Jazz was proof that art could leap over walls, even if society tried to keep them standing. The blues added another layer to leisure, where jazz was often fast, playful, and daring. Blues carried sorrow, longing, and resilience. In speakeasies and theatres, singers like Bessie Smith gave voice to emotions many felt but rarely expressed. Listeners swayed quietly, some with tears in their eyes, finding in the music a safe place for sadness. Leisure was not always laughter. Sometimes it was the relief of being understood. Music also carried people across divides of class. Wealthy Americans hired bands for private parties, filling ballrooms with jazz. Middle-class families invited friends over for record-listening evenings. Working-class neighborhoods held block parties where local musicians played until the street lamps flickered out. Everywhere, the notes echoed, bridging differences for a time. Technology made this possible. The phonograph and the radio were not only inventions, they were gateways. Before them, music had required presence. One had to be near musicians or be a musician oneself. Now, music could travel, be stored, be repeated. Leisure became portable. One could carry the future in a stack of records or tune into it with the turn of a dial. Children grew up in this soundscape. For them, music was not a novelty, but a fact of life. They learned dances at younger ages, sang popular songs on playgrounds, and imitated the movements they saw at family gatherings. The next generation was shaped by rhythm, carrying its habits forward. Even decades later, those who had grown up in the 1920s recalled the music with nostalgia, remembering not only the notes but the feelings, the thrill of youth, the glow of lights, the freedom of laughter. As the decade drew toward its close, the music only grew louder, more confident, more entwined with leisure. Yet beneath the bright sounds, shadows gathered. Economic troubles loomed, though few noticed amid the clinking glasses and echoing horns. For now, leisure remained golden, wrapped in song. When Americans of the 1920s looked back years later, many remembered the music first. They recalled the way it filled nights, softened days, and gave them courage to try new steps. They remembered radios crackling in quiet rooms, bands roaring in crowded halls, singers pouring sorrow into melodies that healed. They remembered how, for a decade, leisure was not only what they did, but what they heard. Music, in the end, was more than a pastime. It was a way of being together, of imagining possibility, of touching the future. The Roaring Twenties roared not only with engines and laughter, but with trumpets, drums and voices. Leisure had found its anthem, and its anthem was jazz. The final notes of the decade had not yet been played. But in every dance, in every record, in every secret speakeasy tune, the music of the 1920s carried forward the heartbeat of a generation at play. The lights dim, the murmurs hush, and the screen glows to life. For a moment, the theatre is filled only with flickering light and then movement. A man in a bowler hat stumbles across the screen, his body loose and rubbery, his face marked by a small moustache. He falls, rises and grins, and the audience bursts into laughter. This was Charlie Chaplin, and this was the magic of the silent film. A world where leisure unfolded in shadows and light, in gestures and expressions, in music played live beside the screen. Cinema in the 1920s was more than entertainment. It was an escape, a portal into other lives, other worlds. For the price of a ticket, ordinary Americans could sit in grand theatres and forget the weight of their days. The laughter of Chaplin, the daring stunts of Harold Lloyd, the sweetness of Mary Pickford, these were not just performances, but companions to millions who sought rest in the dark. The movie palaces themselves were part of the wonder. Across cities, enormous theatres rose, adorned with marble, chandeliers and velvet curtains. To enter one was to step into luxury, even for those who lived modestly. For a few hours, the theatre made everyone equal, bathed in the same golden light. Leisure was not only on the screen, but in the very act of sitting in such grandeur, feeling part of something larger than oneself. In small towns, the experience was humbler, but no less cherished. Converted storefronts became makeshift cinemas, where wooden chairs creaked and projectors rattled. Children saved coins for tickets, hurrying to catch Saturday matinees. Farmers and shopkeepers sat side by side, their eyes fixed on the screen, sharing laughter and gasps. Even in its simplest form, cinema transformed leisure into shared wonder. The silent films themselves had a universal language. Without spoken dialogue, they relied on gestures, expressions, and intertitles. This made them accessible across cultures and languages, uniting audiences in ways few art forms could. A pratfall needed no translation. A tear slipping down an actress's cheek was understood everywhere. Leisure here was not only about entertainment, but about connection, about seeing humanity reflected in the simplest of movements. Music accompanied the images, bringing them to life. In large theatres, orchestras played scores that swelled and softened with the story. In smaller venues, a lone pianist or violinist improvised, following the rhythm of the screen. The marriage of image and sound created an experience unlike any before. Though silent, the films spoke through harmony. Leisure was no longer bound by words. It was carried in melody and emotion. The stars of the screen became icons. Charlie Chaplin, with his little tramp character, embodied resilience and humour. Audiences saw in him both the struggles of poverty and the triumph of spirit. Harold Lloyd dangled from clock towers, thrilling crowds with his daring stunts. Clara Bow, the IT girl, embodied modern femininity, her flapper style captivating young women eager to imitate her. These figures lived larger than life, yet they felt familiar, like friends who visited weekly. Leisure was personal, tied to the faces that filled the screen. Hollywood grew rapidly in this decade, transforming from a small town into the heart of global cinema. Sunshine, open landscapes, and new technology allowed studios to flourish. Names like Paramount, Warner Bros. And MGM rose to prominence, producing films at a pace that astonished audiences. The industry became not only a source of stories, but a symbol of American creativity. Leisure, once local and modest, became an empire of dreams projected onto silver screens. Film genres blossomed. Comedies filled theatres with laughter, dramas tugged at heartstrings, romances whispered of possibilities, and adventure films carried viewers across deserts, oceans, and jungles. For a nation that had only recently endured war, cinema offered respite. One could weep, laugh, or gasp without consequence, and emerge lighter than before. Leisure became a form of travel, a journey without leaving one's seat. For many Americans, going to the movies became a weekly ritual. Saturday nights, families dressed in their best and made their way to theatres. Couples on dates held hands in the dim light. Groups of friends whispered and giggled before the lights went down. The theatre became a social space, a gathering point where leisure was both individual and collective. Children, too, found joy in film. Serials with their cliffhanger endings kept young audiences returning week after week, eager to see if the hero survived. Cartoons brought laughter with animated antics, simple yet delightful. In the laughter of children, leisure took on a timeless quality, a reminder that even in a rapidly changing world, joy could be simple. The power of cinema extended beyond the screen. Movie magazines, filled with glossy photos and stories of stars, became popular reading. Fans wrote letters to their favourite actors, collected pictures, and imitated their styles. Leisure was no longer limited to the theatre visit. It spilled into daily life, shaping fashion, conversation, and even dreams. And yet, beneath the glamour, the silent film era carried fragility. The technology was still young. Projectors sometimes broke, films sometimes burned, and sound was still absent. But none of this mattered to audiences. What mattered was the experience, the chance to step into another world. Leisure thrived not in perfection, but in wonder, in the shared gasp as a hero leaped, or the shared sigh as lovers embraced. In this way, cinema of the 1920s reflected the spirit of the decade, bold, playful, experimental, yet grounded in the desire for joy. The golden age of silent film stars was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. For the first time in history, Ordinary people began to know the names and faces of entertainers who lived thousands of miles away. A farmer in Iowa, a shop clerk in Boston, a schoolteacher in Oklahoma, all could sit in darkened theatres and watch the same glowing figures, their gestures magnified larger than life. The silent screen transformed actors into icons, and these icons shaped the leisure of millions. Charlie Chaplin remained the most beloved of them all. His A Little Tramp character was both comical and deeply human. He tripped, stumbled, and misstepped his way across the screen, yet always managed to emerge with dignity. Audiences laughed at his clumsy adventures, but they also recognized something of themselves in his resilience. For those who struggled in real life, Chaplin offered not only humour, but hope. Leisure, in his hands, was both escape and reflection, a reminder that even hardship could be softened with a smile. Mary Pickford, often called America's sweetheart, gave audiences another kind of comfort. With her golden curls and gentle presence, she embodied innocence, warmth and charm. Young women looked up to her as a model of grace, while families admired the wholesome stories she told. When Mary Pickford appeared on screen, theatres filled with sighs and smiles. She was more than an actress. She was a symbol of the goodness audiences wanted to believe still existed in the world. Then came Clara Bow, the fiery it girl who electrified the decade. With her short hair, playful smile, and bold style, she embodied the flapper spirit. Clara Bow was not demure or reserved. She was vibrant, daring, and alive. For young women experimenting with independence, she became a hero. For young men, she was irresistible. Leisure through her films was not about quiet escape, but about the thrill of possibility, the rush of modern life. Other stars filled the screens with variety. Douglas Fairbanks swung across sets as a swashbuckling hero, leaping with athletic grace. Rudolph Valentino, the Latin lover, set hearts aflame with his smouldering looks and romantic roles. Audiences fainted, cheered, and swooned. For many, the leisure of cinema was not only about laughter, but about fantasy, a safe space to feel emotions too daring for daily life. The rise of these stars created a new kind of cultural fascination. Magazines printed their photographs, newspapers followed their lives, and fans collected their autographs. People began to copy their fashion. Mary Pickford's curls, Clara Bow's dresses, Valentino's sleek style. Movie stars shaped not only how people spent their leisure in theatres, but how they presented themselves in daily life, and the spaces where these stars came to life were spectacles in themselves. Movie palaces rose in cities across America, each more ornate than the last. These were not simple theatres, they were temples to leisure. Chandeliers glittered overhead, velvet draped from balconies, and marble staircases wound their way upward. Murals painted on ceilings showed stars, clouds, and heavenly scenes, as if to remind audiences they were about to enter another world. To step inside a movie palace was to step into luxury. For working-class families, the experience was astonishing. Many had never seen such grandeur in their lives, and yet here it was, offered for the price of a ticket. Theatres treated every visitor as royalty, no matter their background. Ushers in fine uniforms guided patrons to their seats, where they sank into plush cushions. The show began not with the film, but with music, as mighty organs or full orchestras filled the air with sound. The film itself was only part of the evening. The theatre experience became an event, a ritual of escape. People arrived early, dressed in their best, and lingered afterward, talking excitedly about the story they had seen. Couples made dates of it, friends gathered in groups, and families used it as a treat for children. The movie palace was more than entertainment. It was a sanctuary where ordinary lives brushed against dreams. Escapism became the essence of this culture. The decade was marked by rapid change, urban growth, shifting gender roles, economic experiments, and lingering memories of war. For many, daily life felt unstable, filled with questions about the future. Cinema offered relief. On screen, life unfolded in simple arcs. Love found, challenges overcome, villains defeated. Even when films ended in sorrow, the sorrow was controlled, contained, and beautiful. Unlike real life, the screen gave endings that made sense. Escapism also meant travel without movement. Adventure films carried audiences to distant lands where deserts stretched endless and jungles teemed with danger. Romantic films took them into glittering ballrooms or moonlit gardens. Comedies shrank the world into pratfalls and laughter. For a few hours, the troubles of daily life slipped away, replaced by visions of elsewhere. Leisure became a journey, guided by the flicker of light. Yet escapism did not mean forgetting entirely. In subtle ways, films reflected the anxieties and desires of their time. The daring of Clara Bow reflected the growing independence of women. The humour of Chaplin spoke to the struggles of the poor. The romance of Valentino touched on cultural tensions about love, identity, and exoticism. Audiences escaped into the films, but they also saw their own lives refracted through them. Leisure, then, was both flight and mirror. For children and young people, cinema became especially enchanting. The Saturday matinee was a highlight of the week, filled with serial adventures that ended on cliffhangers. Would the hero survive? Would the villain be caught? The only way to know was to return the next. Leisure here was not only about watching, but about anticipation, the sweet ache of waiting for the story to continue. Cartoons added another layer of joy. Simple animations with dancing animals and mischievous characters made children laugh loudly, their voices filling theatres with delight. Adults chuckled too, reminded of playfulness. In these moments, leisure transcended age, uniting generations in shared laughter. The ritual of cinema grew so powerful that it began to shape the rhythm of life. Work weeks ended with plans for the movies. Newspapers advertised coming attractions, and people circled dates with excitement. Conversations on Monday mornings often began with a "Did you see?" The theatre was not only entertainment but a social hub, a cultural heartbeat. In this golden age, the leisure of film blurred lines between fantasy and reality. Movie stars felt close, almost like friends, even though they lived lives far removed from ordinary Americans. The grandeur of palaces lifted audiences into worlds of beauty, even as they returned home to modest houses. The screen promised adventure, romance, laughter and tears, and in delivering these, it gave people something even greater, the ability to dream together. Cinema in the 1920s was more than a pastime. It became a mirror and a mould, shaping how people dressed, walked, talked, and even dreamed. For the first time, identity was not only something inherited from family or community, but something chosen and influenced by images from the screen. Silent films gave people new scripts for how to live, and many followed eagerly. Fashion was one of the clearest marks of cinema's influence. Before movies, style often moved slowly, passed along by word of mouth, magazines, or travelling displays. But in the Roaring Twenties, what Mary Pickford wore on screen could become a national trend within weeks. Women copied her curls, carefully pinning their hair to mimic her youthful, angelic look. Department stores advertised a Pickford dresses or a Pickford shoes, capitalizing on the actress's popularity. It was as if audiences wanted not only to watch their stars, but to step into their lives. Clara Bow's influence was even more dramatic. As the Ike girl, she defined the flapper image that swept across cities. Her short bob haircut, bold lipstick, and loose dresses became symbols of freedom and modernity. Young women who had never seen themselves as daring suddenly felt emboldened to trim their hair and dance in shorter skirts. Leisure here was not only about watching, but about transformation. Cinema encouraged people to experiment with identities they had never considered before. Men too followed the lead of stars. Douglas Fairbanks's athletic elegance inspired many to embrace sportswear and a more casual, active lifestyle. Rudolph Valentino's sleek suits and polished shoes led others to cultivate a refined, romantic image. His mannerisms, the tilt of his head, the smoulder of his gaze, were imitated endlessly. Some even grew moustaches in his style, hoping to capture a fraction of his allure. This imitation was not superficial. For many, adopting these styles was a way of participating in the modern world. The old ways of dress and behaviour felt too heavy, tied to a past of hardship and tradition. By modelling themselves on film stars, ordinary people felt lighter, freer, and more connected to the spirit of the new age. Cinema gave them permission to reinvent themselves, even if only in small gestures. Beyond fashion, films shaped values and aspirations. Audiences absorbed ideas about romance, adventure, and morality through the stories they watched. For some, this meant expecting grand gestures in love, inspired by Valentino's dramatic declarations. For others, it meant believing in resilience, as shown in Chaplin's tireless determination. Leisure became an education of sorts, teaching lessons through laughter and tears. Yet this education was complicated. Critics at the time worried that films encouraged unrealistic dreams. They feared that women expected every romance to be cinematic, or that men pursued glamour instead of substance. Newspapers ran debates about whether the movie craze was corrupting youth, distracting them from work and study. But even those critics admitted something undeniable. Cinema had become a part of life, impossible to ignore. The communal nature of movies made their influence even stronger. Unlike books, which people often read alone, films were experienced in groups. A whole audience gasped together when Valentino kissed his leading lady, or laughed in unison when Chaplin tumbled into a fountain. This collective reaction created bonds between strangers, as if everyone shared a secret. The memory of the film became not only personal but communal, layered with the sound of hundreds of others reacting at the same time. Families carried these memories home. Children reenacted scenes in backyards, mimicking the adventures of their favourite heroes. Couples reminisced about romantic films they had seen on dates. Friends quoted comedic lines, even though the lines were silent, remembered through title cards and gestures. Cinema wove itself into daily conversation, into jokes, into memories passed down through generations. The effect of cinema reached beyond entertainment into identity on a national scale. Americans began to see themselves as part of a larger story, one connected by shared screens and stars. A factory worker in Detroit and a banker in New York could both admire the same actors, laugh at the same jokes, and dream similar dreams. This shared leisure created a cultural glue, binding together people of different classes and backgrounds. Hollywood itself became part of the dream. Though most Americans would never set foot in California, the idea of Hollywood shimmered in their imaginations. It was a place of palm trees, sunshine, and endless possibility. Magazines published photographs of movie sets and star homes, fueling the fantasy. For many, Hollywood was not just a city, but a symbol of modern magic, proof that ordinary lives could be transformed into extraordinary stories. At the same time, cinema shaped collective memory of the decade itself. The 1920s became remembered not only through newspapers or personal accounts, but through the glow of film reels. When people look back, they often recalled the laughter of Chaplin, the daring of Beau, the romance of Valentino. These stars did not only entertain, they became emblems of the age, shorthand for what it felt like to live through the Roaring Twenties. The silent era also taught audiences the language of images. Without spoken dialogue, viewers learned to read meaning in glances, gestures, and expressions. They became sensitive to nuance, the way a hand lingered on a doorknob, the tilt of a hat, the flicker of a smile. This visual literacy shaped how people perceived one another in real life too. Leisure in the theatre subtly influenced how people understood communication outside of it. As the decade moved forward, a change began to whisper through the industry. In 1927, the jazz singer introduced synchronized sound, signaling the birth of the talkie. For many, this was thrilling, a new step in cinema's magic. Yet, for others, it marked the end of something irreplaceable. Silent films had created a universal language understood across accents, cultures, and backgrounds. With sound, barriers would return. The final years of the 1920s held both the triumph of silent cinema and the bittersweet knowledge that it was fading. But even as sound prepared to take over, the legacy of the silent screen was already secure. It had given a generation its dreams, its fashions, its memories. It had offered comfort in hardship, joy in routine, and companionship in loneliness. In darkened theatres, people found themselves reflected and transformed. Leisure was no longer only about rest. It was about participation in a shared cultural adventure. When audiences left the theatres at night, they carried something intangible with them. Perhaps it was a new way of walking, inspired by a favourite star. Perhaps it was a fragment of melody from the organ or the sparkle of chandeliers overhead. Perhaps it was simply the memory of laughing beside strangers, united in delight. These fragments accumulated, week after week, until they became part of who people were. The final reels of the silent era flickered with poignancy. Chaplin, Pickford, Bow, Fairbanks, Valentino. These names became etched into history, not only for their artistry, but for their role in shaping leisure. They turned free time into something luminous, something shared, something memorable. For Americans in the roaring 20s, cinema was not just a diversion. It was a way of being, a way of dreaming, a way of belonging to a story larger than themselves. And so, as the decade drew toward its close, silent films left behind a world forever changed. Fashion had shifted, identities had evolved, and collective memory had been stamped with glowing images on silver screens. The lights dimmed, the projectors whirred, and audiences leaned forward, eager, expectant, and ready for whatever story would come next. Leisure in the Roaring Twenties was not only about music, films, or dance halls. It was also about the thrill of competition, the rhythm of games, and the joy of play. Across America, people gathered in stadiums, fields, parks, and even living rooms to watch, cheer, and take part in sports and games that gave free time its own special energy. If jazz gave the decade its soundtrack, sports gave it its heartbeat. Baseball reigned supreme as the national pastime. Long before television brought games into homes, crowds flocked to ballparks, eager for the crack of the bat and the roar of the stands. Stadiums filled with men in straw hats, women waving handkerchiefs, and children clutching programs. Vendors walked the aisles, calling out offers of peanuts, soda, and cigars. The game itself unfolded slowly, patiently, with pauses that gave fans time to talk, laugh, and savor the summer air. Babe Ruth stood at the center of it all, larger than life, both in stature and in legend. 5 in stature and in legend. His home runs soared into the stands with such force that they seemed to defy gravity. For many fans, Ruth embodied the spirit of the age, bold, exuberant, and unafraid to chase greatness. People spoke of his swings as though they were magic, and children practiced in sandlots, dreaming of one day hitting like him. He turned baseball from a quiet pastime into a spectacle of power. Yet baseball's story in the 1920s was not only about the heroes of the major leagues. Across America, communities nurtured their own teams. Local clubs, industrial leagues, and small-town competitions filled weekends with excitement. Games were social gatherings as much as athletic contests, bringing neighbours together to picnic, gossip, and cheer. Fathers taught sons how to throw, while mothers brought baskets of food to share in the stands. In these moments, leisure became family tradition, woven into the rhythm of community life. But the era also carried a reminder of separation. While the major leagues were celebrated, African American players were barred from joining them. In response, independent black baseball leagues flourished, creating their own rich and vibrant culture of the sport. Teams like the Kansas City Monarchs and the Chicago American Giants drew enormous crowds, their players dazzling with speed, skill, and creativity. Satchel Paige, with his legendary pitching, became a name spoken with awe, even among those who never saw him play. For fans who attended these games, the experience was electric. The stands pulsed with energy, music, and laughter. Between innings, bands played, and the spirit of celebration carried through every play. For many black families, these games were more than sport. They were affirmation, proof of talent and resilience in a world that tried to limit them. The independent leagues showed how leisure could also be defiance, a joyful assertion of dignity through play. While baseball filled the summer, boxing set the nights on fire. Prize fights drew crowds to smoky arenas where tension thickened with every round. Radios carried the matches into homes and taverns, allowing listeners to follow each blow with bated breath. The sport was brutal, yet strangely poetic. 2 figures circling, striking, enduring, testing the limits of body and will. Jack Dempsey became the titan of the ring. Known as the Manasseh Mauler, his ferocity and power thrilled audiences. His fights were national events covered by newspapers in minute detail. When he stepped into the ring, silence fell, broken only by the bell that signaled the start. Then came the flurry of punches, the roar of the crowd, the drama of triumph or defeat. For many, Dempsey embodied the raw strength and intensity of the decade. Leisure in the Roaring Twenties was not only about music, films, or dance halls. It was also about the thrill of competition, the rhythm of games, and the joy of play. Across America, people gathered in stadiums, fields, parks, and even living rooms to watch, cheer, and take part in sports and games that gave free time its own special energy. If jazz gave the decade its soundtrack, sports gave it its heartbeat. But perhaps the most meaningful fight of the 1920s was not only about Dempsey. It was about Jack Johnson before him and Joe Louis soon after, boxers who challenged barriers as well as opponents. Although segregation limited opportunities, black boxers fought their way into the national imagination. Their victories carried symbolic weight, defying expectations and stirring pride in communities that saw themselves reflected in the ring. Leisure here was both entertainment and silent revolution. Sports were not only about the stars, though. They were about everyday games played in alleys, fields and backyards. Children invented makeshift baseball diamonds with sticks for bats and chalk for bases. Families gathered for card games after supper, laughter mixing with the shuffle of decks. Men played checkers outside barbershops, while women organised church socials filled with parlour games. Evenings were often simple but cherished, a reminder that leisure did not always require grandeur, only togetherness. Board games gained new popularity in the decade, offering families inexpensive ways to bond. Games like mahjong and dominoes became household staples, their clattering tiles and counters echoing through kitchens and parlours. These games carried a slower pace, a counterbalance to the frenzy of modern life. They encouraged conversation, patience, and the quiet satisfaction of strategy. For many, they were as much about companionship as competition. Card games, too, held a central place in leisure. Bridge, poker, and canasta filled evenings with suspense and amusement. Friends gathered around small tables, sipping drinks and smiling at each other's fortunes and misfortunes. The games were rituals as much as contests, offering a framework for socializing, teasing, and storytelling. Leisure, in these circles, was not about spectacle but intimacy, the joy of shared time. In towns and cities alike, children's games brought laughter to streets and playgrounds. Hopscotch, marbles, tag, and jump rope kept afternoons lively. Many of these games were timeless, passed down through generations, yet they carried a special joy in the 20s, when prosperity allowed more time for play. Watching children at leisure reminded parents of simpler days, even as the world around them shifted. For adults, leisure often took the form of sports leagues connected to workplaces or churches. Softball teams, bowling clubs, and even dart leagues gave workers a chance to relax outside the grind of labour. These games built friendships and eased tensions, turning colleagues into teammates. Leisure here was practical as well as pleasurable, a way to strengthen community bonds. Sports writers added another layer to the culture of play. Newspapers filled with columns that turned athletes into legends, recounting their feats in glowing detail. Writers like Grantland Rice transformed baseball and boxing into epics, describing games as if they were battles of myth. Fans devoured these accounts, reliving the excitement through words. Leisure became not only an activity, but a story carried by ink and imagination. Radio deepened this connection. A family gathered around a set could listen together as announcers described the crack of the bat or the swing of a punch. Even without pictures, the imagination filled in the gaps, painting vivid scenes in the mind. Leisure became accessible across distance, uniting listeners in shared anticipation and joy. The influence of sports reached into fashion as well. Men wore caps modelled after ball players, while women adopted casual attire suited for tennis or golf. Athleticism became stylish, reflecting the decade's fascination with energy and movement. Leisure was no longer only about rest, but about vitality, about showing that one could both work hard and play with vigour. At its heart, though, the sports and games of the Roaring Twenties were about connection. Whether through a grand boxing match, a local ball game, or a quiet evening of cards, people sought moments of togetherness. In an age of rapid change, play offered stability. It reminded people that joy could be found not only in jazz clubs or movie palaces, but in the simple act of cheering, laughing, and sharing time. And so, as the decade unfolded, sports and games etched themselves into memory. They were not only distractions, but rituals, shaping how Americans spent their free time. From the thunder of a home run to the gentle shuffle of cards, leisure revealed itself in every corner of life, vibrant, playful, and profoundly human. If baseball was the national pastime and boxing the thrill of the night, then college football was the grand spectacle of autumn. On crisp Saturdays, crowds in sweaters and coats poured into stadiums, their voices rising in waves of chants and cheers. Bands played fight songs with brassy vigour, cheerleaders led call and response rhythms, and pennants waved above the stands like banners of loyalty. Football was not just a game. It was a pageant, a ritual that bound students, alumni, and entire towns together. Universities competed for glory, their reputations riding on the strength of their teams. The names of legendary coaches and players spread far beyond the campus walls. Redgrange, nicknamed the Galloping Ghost, became the icon of the decade, his speed and grace turning him into a national sensation. When he carried the ball, whole stadiums seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the explosion of motion that followed. His performances drew newspaper headlines that rivaled those of political leaders, proving just how deeply football captured the public imagination. For students, the games were more than contests, they were social occasions. Young men and women met on bleachers, exchanged shy glances, and laughed over halftime chatter. Alumni returned to their alma maters, renewing bonds and traditions. Townspeople embraced the energy, decorating shop windows in school colours and hosting parades before big games. Football Saturdays became festivals of leisure, blending sport, music, fashion, and community pride into a single experience. Even those who knew little of the rules could feel the excitement. The thunder of marching bands, the sight of young athletes charging across the field, the swell of voices singing in unison, all of it created an atmosphere of belonging. Leisure, in these moments, was not about understanding every detail, but about sharing in the collective joy. As autumn gave way to winter and spring, other sports carried their own sense of elegance and charm. Golf, once seen as the pastime of the wealthy, spread in popularity during the 1920s. Country clubs expanded and public courses opened, welcoming players eager to test their swings. For many, golf was as much about the setting as the sport. Rolling greens, quiet landscapes, and the gentle pace of the game offered respite from the bustle of city life. Walter Hagen became the hero of the fairways, his confidence and skill reshaping golf's image. He was stylish, charismatic, and unapologetically modern, embodying the spirit of the 20s, even in a sport once considered stiff and conservative. Hagen's presence attracted new fans, and suddenly, golf felt less like an old tradition and more like a fashionable pursuit. Leisure here combined status with relaxation, elegance with friendly competition. Tennis, too, carried a similar aura of refinement. On sunlit courts, players in crisp white attire exchanged volleys, their movements graceful and precise. Matches were both sport and social theatre. Spectators admired not only the skill of the players, but the atmosphere of sophistication surrounding the game. For women in particular, tennis became a way to embrace athleticism while also participating in fashionable social life. Suzanne Lenglen of France, though playing abroad, influenced American fans with her daring style and remarkable dominance, proving that tennis could be as dramatic as any boxing match or baseball game. Country clubs became the epicenter of this new social leisure. More than places to play, they were spaces to see and be seen. Members gathered not only for golf or tennis, but for dances, dinners, and conversations on shaded verandas. Families dressed in their best, children ran across lawns, and evenings ended with music drifting from ballrooms. For the middle and upper classes, country clubs offered a way to blend sport, elegance, and community into a single lifestyle. At the same time, city parks provided a more accessible version of this leisure for the working and middle classes. Public courts and fields buzzed with activity, from tennis matches to casual baseball games. Families spread blankets under trees, children played tag along the edges, and friends shared stories as they watched. These gatherings lacked the grandeur of the clubs, but carried the same essence of togetherness. Leisure, whether framed by chandeliers or open skies, was ultimately about connection. Sports also influenced fashion in everyday life. Sweaters in school colours, pleated skirts and varsity jackets became symbols of youthful style. Women wore shorter skirts that allowed freer movement on tennis courts, while men embraced sport coats and caps inspired by golfers. Athletic fashion spilled into daily wear, blending comfort with modern flair. Leisure left its imprint not only on how people spent their time, but on how they presented themselves to the world. Radio amplified all of these experiences. Families could follow football games, golf tournaments, and tennis matches without leaving their homes. The voice of the announcer painted vivid pictures, carrying listeners into the heart of the action. They leaned closer to their sets, imagining the field, the players, the final dramatic moments. For those who could not travel to stadiums or clubs, radio made leisure immediate and intimate, turning the living room into a theatre of sport. Photographs and newsreels added another dimension, allowing fans to see highlights of games in local theatres. Moving images of touchdowns, swings, and volleys played before feature films, linking the grandeur of cinema with the excitement of sport. Audiences clapped and cheered as if they were watching live, proof that the spirit of competition could reach even beyond the field. What made sports in the 1920s so powerful was not only the games themselves, but the way they drew people together. Whether in the roar of a football stadium, the quiet grace of a golf course, or the spirited volleys of a tennis court, leisure carried with it a sense of belonging. It reminded people that free time could be more than rest. It could be celebration, identity, and community. And as athletes rose to fame, they joined musicians and film stars as cultural icons of the decade. Red Grange, Walter Hagen, Suzanne Lingland, their names echoed alongside Chaplin and Ruth, symbols of an age where play became as meaningful as work. The Roaring Twenties were not only about jazz and cinema, but also about the thrill of the game, the elegance of sport, and the joy of watching others achieve greatness. If stadiums and arenas roared with the thrill of athletic contests, the quieter corners of the 1920s belonged to families and neighbours. Beyond the headlines of Babe Ruth's home runs or Red Grange's dazzling runs, most Americans found their leisure in simpler, humbler activities, fishing by a shaded river, sharing sandwiches on a blanket at the park, or gathering on town greens for a summer festival. These softer pastimes, less glamorous than Hollywood or boxing rings, carried their own profound significance. They anchored daily life, reminding people that joy could be found in the ordinary. Fishing remained one of the most beloved pastimes. Men rose early on weekends, their tackle boxes rattling softly as they made their way to lakes and streams. Children followed, eager to learn the patience required to sit still by the water. There was no stadium crowd, no announcer. Only the lapping of waves, the hum of insects, and the occasional splash that signaled success. For many families, fishing was both recreation and tradition, a way to pass down knowledge across generations. The satisfaction of catching even a small perch or trout seemed magnified by the calm that surrounded it. Picnics carried a similar sense of timeless pleasure. Parks across the country filled with families spreading quilts across the grass, unpacking baskets of fried chicken, sandwiches, apples, and lemonade. Mothers passed out plates while children darted in and out of trees, laughing as they played tag or chased one another. Fathers joined in games of catch or dozed in the afternoon warmth. Radios sometimes accompanied these outings, their crackling voices blending with birdsong as families listened to a ball game while eating under the open sky. For young couples, picnics carried romance. A walk through a wooded trail, a shared blanket, the intimacy of music played softly on a portable gramophone. These moments became memories treasured long after. Courtship in the 1920s was no longer confined to parlours and chaperone dances. The outdoors provided a freer, more relaxed space where conversation flowed easily. Leisure here was about connection, about taking time away from crowded streets to simply be together. Community festivals were another highlight of local life. Every town, no matter how small, seemed to hold parades, fairs, or carnivals at least once a year. Streets filled with banners and bunting, bands marched proudly, and floats decorated with crepe paper rolled past cheering crowds. Children clutched balloons, neighbours exchanged greetings, and food vendors filled the air with the smell of roasted corn, popcorn, and candy. These gatherings blended tradition with celebration, offering respite from routine and giving everyone something to anticipate. County fairs, in particular, showcased both competition and camaraderie. Farmers displayed their best livestock and crops, hoping to win ribbons and recognition. Local bakers and seamstresses presented pies and quilts for judging, proud of their skill. Children rode carousels, teenagers tried their luck at games of chance, and families ended the day with fireworks lighting the evening sky. The fairground, with its laughter and scents and music, embodied the essence of leisure in its purest form. People coming together to share pride, play, and pleasure. Board games and card games added to the home-centered leisure. Families gathered around kitchen tables, shuffling decks or rolling dice. Games like checkers, dominoes, and bridge became staples of evenings spent indoors. They cost little, but they carried immense social value, offering a chance to laugh, compete, and bond. In an era before television, these games filled hours with joy. Even the youngest children could participate, their small hands moving pieces with determination as parents encouraged them. Music wove itself into these family gatherings as well. While jazz clubs thrived in cities, in small towns and homes the sound of a piano or violin often filled the air. Amateur musicians played familiar tunes, while others sang along. Sometimes it was church hymns, sometimes popular songs from vaudeville or radio. Leisure was not only about consuming entertainment, but also about creating it. These evenings of homemade music stitched together families and communities with melody. Seasonal pastimes added rhythm to the year. In winter, ice skating brought people to frozen ponds, their breath misting in the cold air as blades scraped softly across the surface. Couples held hands for balance, children learned to glide, and families sipped hot cocoa afterward. Sleigh rides offered another kind of magic. The jingling of harness bells, the crunch of snow beneath runners, the laughter of bundled passengers under warm blankets. Spring and summer brought baseball at every level, not only in major league stadiums, but in local sandlots and open fields. Children chalked bases onto dusty ground, swung makeshift bats, and argued over rules with the same passion as professionals. Adults joined after work, forming neighborhood teams that played under fading sunlight. These games may never have been chronicled by newspapers, but for the participants they carried the thrill of triumph and the sting of defeat just the same. Leisure also meant Sunday drives, a distinctly modern pastime made possible by the spread of automobiles. Families piled into cars, packed with picnic baskets or simply a desire to see the countryside. Roads wound past farms, rivers, and new roadside attractions. For many, the car itself became a symbol of freedom. No longer tied to schedules of trains or trolleys, they could choose their own path, linger where they wished, and create their own adventures. The journey often mattered as much as the destination. Gardening, too, offered satisfaction to those with a patch of soil. Tending to flowers or vegetables provided both practical rewards and quiet pleasure. Families grew tomatoes, beans, or roses, proud to share their harvest with neighbours or place a vase of fresh blooms on the dinner table. In an age of constant change, the act of nurturing something steady and alive gave people a sense of continuity. Children invented endless forms of play. They jumped rope in alleys, rolled hoops down sidewalks, or played marbles on dusty patches of earth. Their laughter echoed through neighbourhoods, a reminder that leisure often needed no equipment beyond imagination. In rural areas, children explored barns, fields, and creeks, weaving games out of the landscape itself. The simplest amusements left the deepest impressions, shaping childhood memories for years to come. Church socials and community gatherings also provided structure for leisure. Potluck dinners, choir performances, and holiday celebrations brought neighbours together in shared purpose. These events were less about spectacle than about fellowship. They reminded people that free time could be sacred in its own way, a chance to strengthen ties and reaffirm belonging. What united all of these pastimes, fishing, picnics, festivals, board games, seasonal traditions, was their accessibility. They required little money, little travel, and little more than willingness to pause the demands of daily life. In their own quiet way, they balanced the more extravagant leisure of jazz clubs, movie palaces, and stadiums. They gave ordinary Americans the chance to claim joy for themselves in spaces close to home and among people they loved. Leisure in the 1920s was thus a spectrum. At one end were the roaring nights of speakeasies, the glamour of Hollywood, and the grandeur of football stadiums. At the other were quiet afternoons of fishing, laughter-filled picnics, and the glow of lanterns at a local fair. Together, they painted a complete picture of how Americans truly spent their free time, not in one uniform way, but in countless variations, each carrying its own meaning. For the families who lived it, the memories lingered long after. The taste of lemonade in the shade, the thrill of catching a fish, the sound of fireworks at the county fair. These details became as much a part of the Roaring Twenties as jazz bands or silent films. They were the threads that made leisure not only spectacular, but deeply human. And as the decade moved forward, into the uncertainty of the 1930s, these memories would be cherished even more. When times grew harder, people looked back on those days of simple abundance with fondness. The games, the picnics, the laughter, all became proof that joy could be found in the smallest corners of life. Evening was falling across the United States. Lamps glowed in windows, curtains were drawn against the chill of night, and families settled into their living rooms. A wooden cabinet, polished smooth and standing proud in the corner, became the focus of attention. Children sat cross-legged on rugs, mothers brought in sewing or knitting, fathers adjusted the knobs with careful fingers. Then, through a faint crackle, a voice emerged, clear, confident, carrying across miles of wire and air. The radio had spoken. For millions of Americans in the 1920s, this moment became the heartbeat of leisure. It was unlike anything before. Words and music arriving directly into homes, collapsing distance, connecting people to events far away. The radio did not just provide entertainment, it reshaped the rhythm of daily life. People planned their evenings around broadcasts, marked time by familiar programs, and found themselves part of a vast invisible audience that stretched across cities, towns, and rural farms. So, in its earliest days, radio was still a marvel, almost magical in its mystery. Few understood exactly how voices leapt from towers into the air and landed in boxes miles away. Children imagined tiny performers living inside the cabinet, playing instruments or speaking directly to them. Adults, even while grasping the science, still felt awe. This sense of wonder gave radio its special power. It was not only a machine, but a doorway into another world. Music quickly became the soul of radio. Jazz bands played live in studios, their rhythms carried into homes that had never heard such sounds before. Families in small towns, far from dance halls or theatres, tapped their feet to the syncopated beats of Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Paul Whiteman. For the first time, the latest music was not confined to records or big cities. It travelled on the airwaves, reaching anyone with a set and an ear to listen. Leisure was no longer limited by geography. Classical music also found new audiences. Symphony broadcasts allowed listeners who had never set foot in concert halls to experience the grandeur of orchestras. Even farmhouses miles from the nearest town could resonate with violins and horns. For some, this was not only entertainment but education, a way to expand horizons without leaving home. But perhaps the greatest revolution came through words, through the human voice made intimate by the microphone. Announcers spoke with warmth, their tones steady and inviting. News bulletins carried updates from distant cities, speeches reached more listeners than any hall could hold. Fireside chats and radio sermons gave comfort to people sitting in solitude. The sound of a voice in the room, alive and immediate, changed loneliness into companionship. Sports, too, entered homes with electrifying effect. Baseball games that once required a ticket or newspaper recap could now be followed play by play, pitch by pitch. Announcers painted vivid pictures with words. The crack of the bat, the roar of the crowd, the runner stealing second. Listeners leaned in, holding their breath as if they were sitting in the stands. College football broadcasts did the same, uniting distant fans in simultaneous excitement. Radio turned the living room into a stadium. Drama soon followed. Radio plays, read aloud with passion, brought theatre to people who had never seen a stage. Sound effects, footsteps on gravel, doors slamming, storms brewing, created entire worlds from imagination. Families gasped at suspenseful tales, laughed at comedies, and even wept at romances told only through sound. The power of voice and suggestion proved enough to transport listeners into stories as vivid as any silent film. For children, radio became a source of wonder. Programs were designed just for them, with characters who told stories, sang songs, and invited young audiences to join in games. Bedtime rituals often included gathering by the set for one last story before sleep. The radio became a trusted friend. Its familiar voices, part of the household, itself. Yet what made radio so transformative was not only what it delivered, but how it created community. For the first time, people in distant states could experience events together in real time. When a boxing match or presidential address aired, millions tuned in at once. They laughed, gasped, or cheered as if sitting side by side. This simultaneity, this shared soundscape, gave the nation a new sense of unity. Local stations added their own flavour. In small towns, broadcasters announced church events, whether updates or school plays. Farmers tuned in to hear market prices, while homemakers listened for household tips. These touches made radio feel both vast and personal, global and local at once. The physical presence of the radio in the home reinforced its role. Large sets were treated almost like furniture, placed with pride in parlours and living rooms. Families arranged chairs around them as they once had around fireplaces. The act of gathering to listen became a ritual, a new hearth for the modern age. The glow of dials, the soft hum of tubes, the shared silence before a program began, all of these details built atmosphere, turning leisure into ceremony. Of course, radio also sparked a debate. Some worried it would replace reading, conversation, or traditional gatherings. So, critics claimed children were too absorbed, their imaginations dulled by voices spoon-feeding them stories. Others fretted about morality, fearing jazz broadcasts or daring comedy sketches might corrupt values. Yet even the critics could not resist tuning in. The pull of the radio was irresistible. The commercial side of radio further shaped leisure. Advertisers quickly saw its potential, sponsoring programs and weaving jingles into broadcasts. Household products, cosmetics, and automobiles found their way into living rooms through catchy tunes and persuasive voices. Families hummed along with slogans, sometimes without realizing it. Leisure time became subtly linked with consumer culture, each program a blend of entertainment and persuasion, and yet, for all its commercialism, the radio retained its magic. It was the laughter of a comedy troupe drifting through an open window, the solemn tone of a preacher's sermon, the swell of a dance band playing Under the Stars. It was the thrill of hearing one's favourite song requested and played, knowing that countless others were listening too. The airwaves made America feel smaller, closer, more connected. Leisure, once confined to local spaces, became part of a national rhythm. The hum of a radio in one house echoed the hum in thousands of others, uniting strangers through invisible threads of sound. As the 1920s progressed, the radio did more than transmit voices and music. It began to create celebrities, shape consumer habits, and quietly weave itself into the fabric of everyday life. It was no longer just a box in the corner. It was a cultural engine, and its influence rippled far beyond the living room. The new stars of the radio age emerged not on stage or screen, but behind microphones. Announcers, with their clear diction and warm tones, became as familiar as neighbours. Families knew their names, their voices, their catchphrases. They were trusted companions, guiding listeners through concerts, sermons, or sports events. Unlike film stars who dazzled with appearance, radio stars built intimacy through sound alone. Their voices lived in people's heads and hearts. Singers gained followings as well. Radio carried their music far wider than phonograph records ever could. A performer might sing live in a studio in New York, yet within seconds their voice filled parlours in Kansas, kitchens in Texas, and farmhouses in Ohio. The intimacy was astonishing. Listeners often said it felt as if the singer were right there in the room, singing only to them. This directness created bonds of loyalty that sheet music or records alone could not. Comedy troupes and storytellers also rose to fame. Their timing, wit and warmth, made evenings sparkle with laughter. Listeners quoted their jokes the next day, imitating characters or retelling sketches as if they were part of family lore. The voices of comedians became shorthand for joy, threading themselves into household routines. Sportscasters became celebrities in their own right. The best could paint pictures so vivid that listeners felt transported into stadiums. They were not merely narrators but interpreters, shaping the drama with tone and pacing. When they shouted, "It's gone!" as a baseball soared into the stands, families cheered in their living rooms as if they had witnessed the home run firsthand. But radio's influence extended even further, into commerce. Advertisers quickly realized the potential of reaching vast audiences in their homes, and radio became a new frontier for marketing. Commercials were woven into broadcasts at first subtly, then with increasing creativity. Jingles emerged, short songs that lodged themselves in memory. A few bars of melody, repeated often, could make a brand unforgettable. Soap companies were among the earliest and most aggressive sponsors, promoting their products during serialized dramas aimed at homemakers. These programs, later known as soap operas, blended storytelling with marketing so seamlessly that the two became almost inseparable. Listeners tuned in for characters and plots, yet along the way absorbed advertising messages that shaped shopping habits. Other brands followed suit. Automobiles, breakfast cereals, cosmetics, and household goods all found their way into the airwaves. Leisure time became subtly intertwined with consumer culture as entertainment and advertising marched together. Some critics worried this cheapened the magic of radio, but for many families, the association of beloved programs with products felt natural. To buy a certain soap or cereal was to join the shared experience of listening, The effect was profound. Consumer habits shifted, markets expanded, and brands became household names on a scale never seen before. Radio did not just entertain, it transformed the very landscape of American commerce. Cool. Yet, despite the commercial presence, what listeners remembered most were the moments of connection. Radio wove itself into daily life with astonishing speed. Morning broadcasts offered weather updates and cheerful songs to start the day. Midday programs kept homemakers company while they cooked or cleaned. Evening broadcasts became rituals, drawing families together in living rooms. Children raced home from school to catch favourite shows. Parents adjusted schedules around special broadcasts, whether a presidential address or a live orchestra performance. For many, radio structured time itself, providing a rhythm to the day. The physical act of listening was communal. Unlike a book read in solitude or a letter received privately, radio created shared moments. Families leaned in together, laughing at the same joke, gasping at the same cliffhanger, swaying to the same tune. The sound filled the room, shaping not only leisure, but also relationships. In a world where daily life often scattered people in different directions, the radio pulled them back together, if only for an hour. The shared listening experience extended beyond families. Neighbours sometimes gathered around one set, especially in communities where not every household owned one. A family with a radio became a hub, inviting others over for special broadcasts. Living rooms filled with neighbours, their faces glowing in the lamplight as they listened intently. These gatherings blended hospitality with wonder, reinforcing bonds of friendship. The social dimension of radio also stretched to public spaces. Restaurants and hotels installed sets to attract patrons, offering background music or news bulletins. Travellers could eat dinner while hearing the same voices as diners hundreds of miles away. This sense of simultaneity was new, and it gave radio a strangely unifying power. In rural areas, the radio was especially transformative. Isolation, long a defining feature of farm life, softened under the presence of voices carried across the air. Farmers could hear market updates instantly, no longer relying on delayed reports. Wives who spent long days at home found companionship in music and conversation piped into their kitchens. Children who might never see a city theatre could imagine its grandeur through broadcasts. The radio was a bridge, connecting remote lives to the pulse of the nation. As the decade wore on, the radio even began to shape culture itself. It created national tastes in music, standardizing what people considered popular. It influenced speech patterns as announcers modelled clear, a proper diction. It blurred regional differences, knitting together a cultural identity that transcended geography. For the first time, millions could hear the same jokes, songs and stories at once, creating shared reference points that defined an era. The intimacy of radio also fostered trust. Listeners came to rely on the voices they heard, often feeling as if they knew them personally. This trust amplified the impact of both entertainment and advertising. When an announcer recommended a product, it carried weight because it came from a voice already welcomed into the home night after night. Yet even with its growing influence, radio remained a source of wonder. Families marvelled at the mystery of how invisible waves carried voices across the air. Children pressed their ears close to the speaker, convinced that if they listened hard enough, they might hear the tiny performers inside. Adults, though aware of the science, often felt the same awe. Each broadcast was a reminder that technology could collapse distance, bringing the faraway near. The radio's ability to build stars, sell products, and reshape daily routines was unmatched. But its greatest gift was subtler, the sense of belonging it fostered. In laughter, in song, in the suspense of a story's climax, listeners across the country shared moments together. Leisure was no longer merely personal. It was collective, woven through the airwaves into a shared cultural fabric. By the end of the 1920s, the radio was no longer a novelty. It had become a necessity, as central to leisure as the hearth had once. Families budgeted carefully to buy sets, and once installed, they could hardly imagine life without them. The steady voices, the music, the news, all became part of the rhythm of living, inseparable from the memory of the decade itself. By the late 1920s, radio was no longer just an invention or even an entertainment device. It had become something larger, a unifying force that tied together a nation often divided by geography, class, and tradition. Its invisible waves reached over mountains, across prairies, into cities and small towns alike, bringing with them voices, music, and stories that created a sense of shared identity. In many ways, radio gave the United States a soundtrack for its collective life. The 1920s were years of profound change, of cities booming, jazz echoing, and consumer culture rising. But they were also years of tension, as rural traditions clashed with urban modernity, and old values wrestled with new freedoms. Radio, without intending to, helped bridge these divides. It offered something familiar to all, something that could soften differences and remind people they belonged to the same great story. When a president spoke over the radio, his words did not just appear in the headlines of newspapers the next morning. They were heard directly, his voice carried into homes as if he was sitting in the parlour. This immediacy transformed politics. Leaders were no longer distant figures mediated by print. They became personal presences, their tone and cadence shaping trust in ways no editorial could match. Americans, listening together, experienced politics not as an abstraction but as a shared event. Religious broadcasts had a similar effect. Preachers who once spoke to a few hundred could now reach millions. Sermons crossed state lines, making faith a more collective experience. Congregations still gathered locally, but believers also felt part of something larger, a spiritual community without boundaries. For some, this was exhilarating, proof that God's word could travel as fast as the new century demanded. For others, it was unsettling, as charismatic voices wielded influence far beyond their home pulpits. Either way, radio ensured that faith was no longer only local. It was national. Cultural unity was also built through entertainment. The same comedy routines, the same songs, the same serialized dramas were heard by millions. This meant that a farmer in Nebraska and a shop clerk in Philadelphia could share a laugh over the same joke, hum the same tune, or discuss the same cliffhanger at the end of a story. Radio shrank the country, knitting together people who might never meet, but who nonetheless felt connected by the sounds they heard. For immigrants, the radio was a double-edged gift. On the one hand, it exposed them to English, to American speech patterns, to cultural references that helped them integrate. The announcer's careful diction and phrasing became models for many families learning the rhythms of their new language. On the other hand, the radio could feel like a flood of unfamiliar sounds and values, pressing them to adapt. Still, even when the content felt foreign, the music often spoke across barriers. A waltz, a march, or a lively jazz tune carried emotion that needed no translation. The sense of unity was most powerful during live national events. When the first coast-to-coast broadcasts became possible, listeners felt history itself shift. The knowledge that millions of others were hearing the same thing at the same time was exhilarating. It gave people the sense of belonging to a national moment, as though they were part of a vast, unseen gathering. A prize fight or a political speech could suddenly feel like a shared ritual binding strangers into one audience. This was something entirely new. Newspapers had created a common pool of information, but reading was solitary and staggered. Films dazzled with shared images, but only for those who could attend theatres. Radio was different. It was immediate, simultaneous, intimate. It gave the nation a pulse, one that beat in unison across thousands of miles. In shaping national identity, radio also influenced culture more subtly. It helped establish what was considered American taste. The choice of which bands to broadcast, which songs to replay, which plays to adapt. All these decisions shaped a common repertoire. Regional music like jazz from New Orleans or country ballads from the South found national audiences. In turn, what was once local became national, and what was once niche became mainstream. This democratization of culture was not without conflict. Some worried that regional traditions would be drowned out by homogenization. Others celebrated the chance to share their heritage more widely. Either way, the process of blending sounds and stories over the airwaves laid the groundwork for a truly national culture, one that could accommodate both diversity and unity. Advertising played a role in this national identity as well. Brands advertised coast to coast, creating products that became symbols of American life. To drink the same soda in Maine and California, or to buy the same soap in Chicago and Dallas, was to participate in a shared consumer experience. experience. Radio normalized this by making the products part of beloved programs. A nation that once defined itself through local goods and customs now found common ground in the jingles and slogans that danced out of the radio. Radio also reshaped the rhythms of daily life in ways that prepared the country for the 1930s. The concept of a prime time, certain hours when families were most likely to gather and listen, was born in the 1920s. Broadcasters learned to schedule their best programs for evenings when work was done and people could relax together. This habit of tuning in at predictable times would carry over into the age of television, but its roots were in the radio schedules of the jazz age. The shared soundscape also helped prepare Americans for crises to come. When the Great Depression began in 1929, the radio was already a trusted companion. It had been with families during laughter, music, and daily routines. Now it would also be with them through hardship, offering news, comfort, and a sense of solidarity. Leaders like Franklin D. Roosevelt would use radio to speak directly to citizens in his fireside chats, building trust that might not have been possible without the groundwork laid in the 1920s. Radio also left an imprint on memory. For those who lived through the decade, certain voices and melodies became markers of time. They remembered where they were when they first heard a particular speech, or how they felt when a beloved singer's voice drifted into the room. These memories were not just personal but collective, shared by thousands or millions. In this way, radio shaped not only identity, but also the way the nation remembered itself. By the close of the decade, the radio had achieved something remarkable. It had taken a vast, sprawling nation and given it a common experience. It had blurred the boundaries between local and national, between private and public, between leisure and commerce. It had created stars, spread products, and offered comfort. Most of all, it had taught Americans to listen together, to make sound the thread that bound them into one story. When the 1930s arrived, bringing hardship and uncertainty, the habits formed in the 1920s endured. Families still gathered around the set. They still trusted the voices that spoke to them. They still believed that through the miracle of sound, they were connected to a larger whole. The radio had not only reflected the leisure of the roaring 20s, it had prepared a nation to face the trials ahead with a sense of unity that might otherwise have been impossible. And so, as the jazz age drew to a close, the soft glow of radios in parlours across America symbolised more than entertainment. They were beacons of belonging, of shared laughter, of collective memory. They carried the hum of a nation in motion, stitching together millions of lives into a single fabric of sound. In the stillness of night, when the last notes of a broadcast faded and the set clicked off, listeners often felt the lingering warmth of connection. They knew that they had not listened alone. Across the miles, countless others had heard the same songs, the same stories, the same voices. In that knowledge, they found comfort. The comfort of knowing that in the vastness of America, they were part of something greater, held together by invisible waves that filled the air. The hum of engines, once a curiosity reserved for city streets, became the pulse of American life in the 1920s. The automobile was not new. Cars had existed since the turn of the century, but it was in the roaring 20s that they moved from novelty to necessity, from luxury to everyday presence. More than machines of steel and rubber, cars became vessels of freedom, symbols of modernity, and the quiet companions of leisure. For centuries, human travel had been slow, tethered to the rhythms of horse and foot. Journeys were measured in hours, sometimes in days, sometimes in days. With the spread of the automobile, time itself seemed to accelerate. Distances once considered vast shrank before the steady growl of engines. A picnic that might once have been a day's wagon ride away was now an easy Sunday drive. Visiting relatives, attending events, or simply exploring became less a chore and more a choice. At the heart of this transformation stood Henry Ford and his Model T. Affordable, sturdy, and reliable, it was the car that put America on wheels. By the 1920s, assembly line production had driven costs down so far that middle-class families could dream of ownership. For many, the purchase of a car was the largest investment they would ever make, second only to a home. But unlike a home, a car was mobile, alive with the promise of escape. The simple act of owning an automobile reshaped identity. Families who had once felt bound to their neighbourhoods suddenly had the open road before them. Youths who might have courted on porches or under the watchful eyes of chaperones could now slip away to secluded lanes, radios humming in the background. Couples found privacy, families found adventure, and individuals found independence. The psychological shift was profound. To sit behind the wheel was to hold power over speed and direction. The horse, with its moods and limits, was no longer in charge. The driver was. In a decade obsessed with freedom and novelty, the automobile became the perfect emblem. It was modernity made tangible, humming at the curb, ready to transform ordinary afternoons into adventures. Sunday drives became a ritual. Families piled into cars, dressed in their best or their most comfortable clothes, and set off with no destination more ambitious than the countryside. The journey itself was the pleasure: rolling fields, winding roads, and the simple joy of motion. Windows down, hair tousled by the wind, they discovered leisure in movement. The automobile turned the road into a stage for togetherness, where silence or laughter could flow as easily as the scenery outside. Picnics became more elaborate too. No longer limited to spots within walking distance, families packed baskets, blankets, and gramophones, heading out to lakes, riversides, or parks miles away. The car turned nature into an accessible playground, expanding the range of leisure without requiring wealth. Even modest households could savor the thrill of exploration, creating memories that blended the comfort of home with the freshness of new landscapes. Young people, especially, embraced the automobile as a symbol of their generation's spirit. Cars meant independence from parents, a freedom to roam, to dance, to court. The backseat became both sanctuary and stage, a place of whispered secrets and music shared on portable phonographs. The road was no longer only for errands or work. It was for romance, for rebellion, for adventure, for adventure. But the automobile did more than reshape individual lives. It reshaped the very fabric of American towns and cities. Roads, once narrow and dusty, widened into paved highways. Service stations appeared, glowing beacons promising fuel, oil, and air. Billboards rose along the roadside, advertising everything from cigarettes to sodas, recognizing that drivers had time to look and perhaps to dream. Diners and motels sprouted like new species, designed for travelers who wanted a quick meal or a night's rest along the way. This new infrastructure created its own kind of leisure. The road itself became a destination. Families drove simply to drive, to test the car's endurance and their own. They collected stories of roads conquered, distances covered, towns discovered. The language of leisure shifted. Where once people spoke of garden parties or parlour games, now they boasted of miles travelled, routes taken, sights seen through a windshield. Travel, once a luxury of the wealthy, democratised. A family of modest means might never afford a European holiday, but they could drive to the mountains or the seaside. Vacations expanded in scope and tourism flourished. Resorts, campgrounds, and roadside attractions blossomed, eager to catch the eye of passing motorists. A giant statue, a quirky museum, a painted barn, all became part of the roadside theatre, designed to lure the traveller from asphalt to experience. The car also deepened America's love of independence. Trains ran on schedules, ships on timetables, but a car could leave at dawn or at midnight, as the driver pleased. Journeys were no longer bound to the rhythms of ticket clerks or station clocks. A family could follow a whim, turning left instead of right, discovering towns or landscapes they had never intended to see. Leisure became spontaneous, guided by curiosity rather than constraint. For immigrants and rural families, the automobile was often their first tangible step into modernity. It allowed farm families to sell goods in towns farther away, then linger to see a movie or dine out. It carried new arrivals from crowded tenements to beaches or parks where they could stretch their legs and claim a slice of the American dream. The car promised not just mobility but dignity, a sense of being part of the new century's rhythm. Yet for all its promise, the automobile also reshaped leisure in complex ways. The joy of freedom sometimes gave way to frustration in traffic jams as cities swelled with cars their streets could not yet handle. The serenity of countryside picnics was occasionally broken by the intrusion of other families with the same idea, the same road, the same car. Accidents, too, reminded people of the risks of speed and motion. Still, the risks were tolerated, even accepted, because the rewards, independence, adventure, novelty, outweighed them. As the decade rolled on, the automobile became more than a machine. It became a character in family stories, a companion in adventures, a setting for memories. People named their cars, polished them, posed for photographs beside them. They spoke of them with affection, pride, and sometimes frustration, but always with the recognition that life without a car felt incomplete. By the end of the 1920s, the automobile was no longer simply a tool for work or transport. It was leisure itself, a pastime, a symbol of the modern age. It offered more than speed and convenience. It offered identity. To own a car was to announce participation in the promises of the decade, to claim a piece of freedom, to join the great movement of wheels and roads that defined the American dream in motion. By the mid-1920s, the car was no longer a mere household possession. It was a ticket to the horizon. What had begun as short Sunday drives soon blossomed into longer journeys, the birth of a distinctly American ritual, the road trip. The road trip. The phrase itself carried a thrill. Not simply travel, but travel for its own sake, with the open highway as both path and destination. Families who once vacationed only in their nearest park began packing for days away. They loaded the car with food, blankets and suitcases, tying luggage to the roof or squeezing it into the trunk. Children pressed their noses to the windows, waiting for the thrill of departure, while parents studied road maps like treasure hunters. The engine's first cough of life marked the beginning of adventure. Highways themselves were still young, often little more than patchworks of local roads strung together. Signs were inconsistent, paving unreliable, and detours common. Yet this only added to the sense of adventure. Every journey carried surprises, a bridge out a muddy patch or a winding detour through a village the family had never heard of. These obstacles turned travel into story. Anecdotes told later with laughter, evidence of resilience and discovery. As more families embraced the road, states and cities realized that the old infrastructure could not hold the tide of automobiles. The 1920s became the great age of highway building. Pavement spread like veins across the country, connecting rural towns to urban centres and giving motorists smoother, faster rides. Routes were numbered, standardised and signposted. What had once been a maze of local roads became networks designed for drivers with maps in hand and wanderlust in heart. The most famous of these roads, though its legend would grow in the years after, was US Route 66. Nicknamed the Main Street of America, it stretched from Chicago to Los Angeles, cutting through plains, deserts and mountains. Even in its earliest form, it symbolized the promise of freedom, the idea that anyone with a car could follow a ribbon of pavement to distant dreams. With highways came a new kind of economy, roadside America. The car, unlike trains, required places to stop along the way, and entrepreneurs quickly realized the possibilities. Service stations multiplied, offering not just fuel but repair, rest and sometimes a friendly chat. Diners with neon signs beckoned motorists to pause for coffee, pie or a plate of eggs at all hours. Motels sprouted along routes, promising affordable rooms for tired travellers who no longer wished to rely on railside hotels. The roadside was more than service. It was spectacle. Attractions cropped up to lure motorists off the road. Giant statues, quirky museums, signs boasting the world's largest of this or that. A family might detour miles out of their way to see a giant ball of twine or a cavern filled with glittering crystals. These stops were whimsical, often absurd, but they turned the road trip into a patchwork of delight. The journey was no longer just about reaching a destination. It was about savouring the oddities along the way. Car culture extended beyond travel. At home, cars became social hubs. Teenagers gathered at drive-ins, parking lots, or roadside stands, using their cars as extensions of their identity. The make, model, and even colour of a car said something about its owner. To drive a sleek roadster was to signal youth and daring. To own a reliable touring car was to proclaim family values and stability. Cars became statements as much as vehicles, woven into self-image and social life. Dating culture shifted dramatically. No longer confined to parlours or chaperoned outings, young couples found freedom in cars. They could cruise town streets, park at scenic overlooks, or attend dances miles away. The automobile in this sense became a silent accomplice to courtship. It was a space of intimacy, privacy and possibility, a rolling cocoon where conversations stretched late into the night. Leisure took on new forms around the car itself. Families polished their vehicles on Saturdays, proud of the shine that caught the sun on Sunday drives. Enthusiasts gathered to compare engines, tyres and designs, forming early car clubs that celebrated not only ownership but also mechanical knowledge. Racing, too, captured imaginations. Dirt tracks and county fairs hosted daring drivers who pushed their machines to the limit, thrilling crowds with speed and spectacle. The automobile also reshaped the American landscape. Cities spread outward as people no longer needed to live within walking distance of work. Suburbs grew, filled with families who commuted by car yet sought quieter lives outside crowded centres. With this expansion came new leisure geographies, amusement parks, beaches and theatres designed with parking lots to accommodate the driving public. Leisure was no longer confined to what could be reached on foot or by trolley. The car widened the circle of possibility. On long drives, families developed rituals. Children played games to pass the time, counting license plates, spotting animals, or guessing the distance to the next town. Mothers unpacked lunches at roadside clearings, turning the hood of the car into a makeshift table. Fathers tinkered with overheated radiators or changed flat tyres, sometimes grumbling but often proud of their resourcefulness. These small moments wove together into memories as enduring as any grand destination. The road trip also became a democratic experience, blurring class lines in subtle ways. While the wealthy could afford luxurious cars and stays at resorts, even modest families could join the adventure. The Grody adventure. A second-hand Ford or Chevrolet, a few gallons of gasoline, and a map were enough to open the road. The automobile offered participation in a shared dream. The idea that freedom and exploration were not limited to the privileged but accessible to anyone willing to drive. The car also amplified America's fascination with speed. The open road tempted drivers to push limits, to feel the exhilaration of motion faster than any horse or bicycle could deliver. Speed became part of leisure itself, not just the destination, but the thrill of getting there quickly. This appetite for velocity foreshadowed the age of highways, racing, and eventually freeways that would dominate later decades. Yet alongside speed came reflection. Many drivers discovered that long hours on the road offered a meditative rhythm. The steady thrum of the engine, the unfolding horizon, the sense of control at the wheel, all created space for thought. Travellers spoke of finding peace in motion, a calm born not from stillness, but from the hypnotic repetition of passing fields, trees and towns. The road was both journey and reverie. As the decade progressed, the automobile became inseparable from the American imagination. Songs celebrated it, stories featured it, advertisements exalted it. The car was no longer just a tool of transport, but a cultural icon. To be modern was to drive. To be free was to roam. To be American, increasingly, was to live with one foot on the accelerator and one hand on the wheel. By 1929, with millions of cars on the road and networks of highways spreading across the continent, roadside America was firmly established. The automobile had given birth not only to new ways of travelling, but to new ways of living. The road was not merely a path from one place to another. It was a stage for identity, for family, for leisure, for dreams, for dreams. By the twilight of the 1920s, the automobile was no longer just a machine that carried Americans from place to place. It had become a mirror in which they saw themselves, their freedoms, their ambitions, their roles within family and society. More than a tool, it was a stage for identity, and the stories spun around it would linger in memory long after the decade itself slipped away. To own a car was to make a statement. The kind of car a family purchased, the way it was maintained, the way it was driven, all became extensions of identity. A polished touring car with gleaming headlights suggested stability and pride, while a modest second-hand sedan spoke of thrift and determination. Youths often preferred speedier models, roadsters with rumbling engines that proclaimed daring and independence. The car became a language without words, a rolling emblem of personality. The automobile also redefined freedom in ways both profound and intimate. For many, it was the first time in history that ordinary individuals could travel vast distances on their own terms, no longer tied to timetables of trains or carriages, no longer bound to the horse's stamina. Drivers charted their own courses. This freedom was intoxicating. Was intoxicating. A journey could begin at dawn or in the middle of the night, could veer left or right on a whim. The road whispered of possibility, of adventures unplanned and discoveries unexpected. This sense of freedom resonated deeply with the spirit of the 1920s, a decade that celebrated breaking away from the past, that thrilled to new rhythms of jazz, new fashions, new ideas. The automobile was not just transportation, it was liberation made mechanical. It embodied the belief that life should be lived widely, that horizons should always be pursued. For young people, the car was nothing short of revolutionary. In earlier generations, courtship had been bound to porches, parlours, and dances overseen by family eyes. The automobile changed all that. A date no longer meant sitting under the gaze of parents. It meant driving into the countryside, parking beneath stars, or visiting a dance hall miles away. The car was both chariot and cocoon, carrying couples into a world of their own making. For many, it symbolized a coming of age, a first taste of autonomy in love and life. Gender roles shifted subtly behind the wheel. Though men were often assumed to be the drivers, many women embraced the car with enthusiasm. For housewives, the automobile opened worlds beyond the immediate neighborhood, trips to markets, visits to friends, excursions to parks. For young women, driving signaled independence, a refusal to remain confined to traditional roles. Advertisements began to depict women at the wheel, stylish and confident, suggesting that modern femininity was inseparable from mobility. There was resistance, of course. Some critics worried that cars gave women too much independence, loosening social constraints. Others fretted over the supposed moral risks of unsupervised drives. Yet the tide was unstoppable. By the end of the decade, the image of a woman confidently steering her own car was no longer shocking. It was emblematic of modern life. The car also reshaped family dynamics. Fathers often took pride in their role as drivers and caretakers of the vehicle, but children and mothers found their own spaces of agency. Children associated the car with excitement and possibility, the anticipation of picnics, the thrill of long drives. Mothers, managing road trips with lunches and maps, became essential partners in the rituals of travel. The family car was a shared project, a shared memory maker, even when arguments flared over directions or breakdowns. Beyond family and gender, the automobile imprinted itself on collective memory. For many, the first car ride was unforgettable. The sensation of speed, the blur of scenery, the sense that the world itself had quickened. Photographs of the decade often feature proud families standing beside their cars, as if the machine were another family member. The car anchored stories told years later. We drove to the mountains one summer, or our first trip to the shore was in that old Ford. A leisure and memory fused, carried forward on wheels. Even the frustrations of driving became part of the lore. Flat tires, overheated radiators, or muddy roads turned into tales of endurance, evidence of resilience. Children who once groaned at long drives remembered them fondly as adults. The discomfort softened into nostalgia. The smell of gasoline, the clatter of engines, the sound of tyres crunching gravel, all became sensory anchors to a past where freedom was new and possibilities endless. Culturally, the automobile helped reshape America's sense of self. It reinforced ideals of independence, of self-reliance, of exploration. The road became a metaphor for life itself. Open, uncertain, waiting to be travelled. Writers and poets began to celebrate highways as symbols of modern existence, blending the practical with the romantic. The automobile was no longer merely a convenience. It was woven into the mythology of the nation, as central to the 1920s as jazz or cinema. Yet, even as it symbolized individuality, the car also created shared experiences. Roadside diners, motels, and attractions were enjoyed by people from all walks of life. A family from Kansas and a traveller from New York might both stop at the same gas station, eat the same pie, listen to the same stories from locals. The automobile democratized leisure, pulling down barriers of geography and, at times, of class. As the decade waned, the automobile stood as both triumph and warning. It had expanded horizons, yes, but it had also begun to crowd city streets with traffic and accidents. Still, few could imagine returning to a world without it. The car had changed how Americans thought of leisure, of love, of family, of identity. It had made motion itself a pastime and freedom itself a memory to be cherished. When people looked back on the roaring 20s, they remembered jazz, flappers, speakeasies, but they also remembered the road. The feel of wind through an open window, The sight of endless highways stretching west, the laughter of children in the back seat, the quiet of a couple parked beneath a summer sky. These were the moments that lingered, moments that defined not just leisure but life. And so, as the 1920s gave way to the hardships of the 1930s, the automobile carried forward its legacy. It remained a symbol of possibility, a reminder that even in uncertain times, the roads stretched on, waiting. The car was not merely a machine of the decade. It was the vessel of dreams, the keeper of memory, the promise that beyond every bend lay something new. The first notes were often faint. A horn warming up, a piano tinkling in a dim room, the shuffle of shoes on a polished floor. Then came the rhythm, syncopated, alive, unlike anything the world had truly known before. This was jazz, the sound that defined a decade, the melody that carried Americans through nights of joy, longing, and escape. The jazz age was not just about music, it was about energy, about a cultural heartbeat that seemed to make everything move faster. In small towns, jazz trickled in through phonograph records and radio waves, its strange rhythms at first startling, but soon intoxicating. In cities, it was impossible to ignore. Dance halls, nightclubs, and theatres pulsed with brass and strings, filling the air with improvisation that seemed to echo the restless mood of the decade. For young people, jazz was freedom. It was the sound of a generation breaking away from its parents' world, the soundtrack to late nights and daring steps. The rhythms encouraged movement, and the dances that followed, the Charleston, the Black Bottom, the Lindy Hop, seemed almost reckless compared to the reserved waltzes of the past. Feet stomped, skirts swirled, arms flung wide in joyous abandon. Dance floors became stages of liberation, where laughter and sweat mixed under hanging lamps and spinning fans. There was something almost dreamlike about the way jazz filled a room. A band might begin with a familiar tune, but within moments, musicians would twist it, bend it, stretch it into something new. Trumpets called, clarinets answered, drums drove it forward, and bass lines grounded the chaos into harmony. No two performances were ever the same, and that unpredictability gave each night its own spark of magic. In Harlem, the music grew from roots both deep and strong. Clubs like the Cotton Club and the Savoy became legendary, places where the best musicians in the world gathered to create soundscapes that thrilled audiences far beyond New York. Louis Armstrong's trumpet, Duke Ellington's orchestra, Bessie Smith's voice, these were not just performers, but architects of culture. They brought with them echoes of blues, ragtime, and spirituals, fusing traditions into something wholly modern. And though the music rose from black communities, it quickly leapt across boundaries of race and class, carried on records and radio. White audiences too flocked to jazz, drawn to its vitality, its freshness, its refusal to stand still. This mixing of cultures was not without tension, but it was also a reminder that music could cross lines that society often drew too harshly. Jazz did not erase divisions, but it blurred them, even if only for the length of a song. The phonograph and radio made jazz personal. In the evenings, families would gather in living rooms as records spun, the crackle of the needle almost as much a part of the song as the music itself. Young men and women practiced new dance steps at home, their laughter spilling into the night. Radios carried live broadcasts from ballrooms, letting people in distant towns feel as though they too were part of the pulsing energy of the city. There was something deeply communal about jazz, even when experienced alone. A solitary listener could be carried away by the sway of a saxophone, while a crowded dance hall found unity in rhythm. The music seemed to speak directly to emotion, joy, sorrow, desire, and in doing so, it connected people in ways words could not. By the mid-1920s, the jazz craze was undeniable. Magazines published articles about its spread. Moralists decried its wildness, claiming it led young people astray. But the very criticisms often only fueled its popularity. To dance to jazz was to feel modern, to feel daring, to participate in something new. Jazz was not simply entertainment, it was identity, a badge of belonging to a decade that wanted to move, to shed the weight of old traditions and embrace the future. The clubs themselves became part of the story. Picture a small jazz club in Chicago on a Saturday night, smoke curling toward the ceiling, glasses clinking, the hum of conversation blending with the thrum of bass. The band takes the stage, a trumpet cutting through the din with a golden note, and suddenly the crowd hushes, all eyes fixed on the performers. Then the rhythm takes hold and the room erupts. Couples swing, dancers clap. The floor seems to tremble beneath the collective heartbeat of the music. And in those moments, time itself felt suspended. Outside, the world might still struggle with prohibition, politics, or economic shifts, but inside, there was only the music. The saxophone carried the worries away, the drums pushed them aside, and the melodies replaced them with joy, with laughter, with possibility. The Jazz Age soundtrack was not confined to dance halls or urban centres. Travelling bands brought it to smaller communities, filling barns and lodges with sound. Even schools and churches felt its presence as students mimicked the moves they had seen in magazines or on stage. By the end of the decade, jazz was not simply a fad. It had embedded itself into the fabric of American life. It was a soundtrack that belonged to everyone who dared to listen, who dared to move. And though the decade would end, though the Great Depression would soon cast its long shadow, the memory of those nights, the trumpets, the laughter, the swaying bodies, would remain, a reminder that in the 1920s, Americans learned to find freedom not only on the open road, but also on the dance floor. By the middle of the decade, the world of jazz had found its heroes. Names once spoken only in local clubs began to echo across the nation, filling headlines, posters, and the dreams of countless listeners. These musicians were more than entertainers. They became symbols of the age, their very presence shaping how people thought about leisure, style, and modern life. Louis Armstrong stood at the heart of this movement. Born in New Orleans, his trumpet carried the history of the city, the brass bands of funerals and parades, the blues drifting from backrooms, the improvisation that turned music into conversation. By the 1920s, Armstrong had made his way north, where his sound became a revelation. His horn didn't just play notes, it spoke with a human voice, full of laughter, sorrow, and triumph. For audiences hearing him for the first time, the experience was unforgettable. They felt, through his music, that life itself had become brighter, sharper, more alive. Another giant was Duke Ellington, whose orchestra at Harlem's Cotton Club redefined sophistication. Where Armstrong's brilliance was fiery and direct, Ellington's was lush, layered, a tapestry of sound that turned dance floors into dreamscapes. His compositions mixed elegance with innovation, weaving jazz into something almost symphonic. People dressed their finest to hear Ellington play, and in doing so, they helped elevate jazz from the margins to the centre of cultural life. Then there was Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues. Her voice carried the weight of human experience, grief, desire, resilience, and when she sang, listeners felt truths that could not be spoken in ordinary words. Smith's records sold by the millions, her influence stretching far beyond the clubs she performed in. Through her, the blues fused with jazz, deepening the emotional core of the era's soundtrack. These stars were not alone. Fletcher Henderson's big band, Jelly Roll Morton's playful genius, and later Cab Calloway's showmanship all added to the mosaic. Jazz was never the work of one musician or one city. It was a chorus of voices, each adding something new, something vital. The clubs where they performed became shrines to this new culture. In Harlem, the Cotton Club stood as both a beacon and a contradiction. Its shows were dazzling. Ellington's band played while dancers in sequins and feathers dazzled the crowd. Celebrities, politicians and socialites came from across the city to experience the glamour. Yet the audiences were segregated, with black performers dazzling white patrons who might never welcome them in other spaces. Still, within those walls, music transcended barriers and the performances became legend. Across town, the Savoy Ballroom offered a different vision. Open doors to all, a vast dance floor where thousands moved in unison to the beat. The Lindy Hop was born here, a dance that embodied the daring and improvisation of jazz itself. Partners leapt, twirled, and flipped in ways that seemed almost impossible, their movements matching the syncopated rhythms of the band. To watch a night at the Savoy was to see energy turned physical, music embodied in motion. Chicago, too, pulsed with its own jazz life. The South Side was alive with clubs, from the Dreamland Cafe to the Sunset Cafe, where legends like Armstrong and Earl Hines carved out new sounds. The city's prohibition-fueled nightlife made jazz the soundtrack of speakeasies, places where rules were bent and the thrill of danger heightened the joy of the music. Chicago jazz carried a rawness, a grit that matched the energy of the city's streets. Even smaller cities and towns caught the fever. Traveling bands brought jazz to ballrooms in Kansas City, St. Louis, and beyond. A high school gymnasium might be transformed for one night, decorated with paper lanterns and banners as a touring orchestra filled it with sound. Young couples, dressed in their best, would dance until their shoes wore thin. For many, these nights were unforgettable. A first kiss, a first dance, a memory that lingered long after the lights dimmed. The spread of jazz was fueled not only by live performance, but also by the twin engines of technology, phonographs and radio. Record companies recognized the hunger for this music and rushed to capture it. Jazz records became bestsellers, carried in department stores alongside household goods, tucked into the corners of general stores, and shipped to rural towns where live performances were rare. A farmer's daughter in Iowa could buy a Bessie Smith record and, in doing so, feel connected to the glamour of Harlem. Radio carried the sound even further. Stations broadcast live performances from ballrooms and clubs, sending Ellington's orchestra or Henderson's band into homes hundreds of miles away. Families gathered around the set, their imaginations filling in the sights of the dance floor as the music drifted through the crackling speakers. For many, the radio was the first introduction to jazz, and once heard, it was impossible to forget. The dance culture that grew alongside jazz became a phenomenon in its own right. Dances like the Charleston were not merely movements of feet, they were declarations of spirit. The high kicks, the swinging arms, the syncopated rhythms, all spoke of a willingness to embrace change, to shed the restrictions of the past. Parents often looked on in shock, worrying about the morality of such abandon, but young people embraced it with delight. For them, the dances symbolized modernity, boldness, and fun. Dance marathons added another layer to this culture. Couples competed to see who could last the longest on the floor, sometimes dancing for hours or even days with only brief rests. These events were grueling, but they drew crowds who marveled at the endurance of the dancers, cheering them on while bands played relentlessly. The spectacle combined sport, theatre, and music, turning leisure into something both competitive and communal. There was something profoundly democratic about jazz and its dances. Though it began in specific communities, by the height of the 1920s, jazz belonged to everyone who embraced it. A wealthy socialite in New York and a factory worker in Ohio might move to the same rhythms, sing the songs, and find joy in the same melodies. In a decade marked by both prosperity and disparity, jazz provided a common language, one that was spoken in dance steps, in trumpet notes, in shared nights of abandon. The influence of jazz reached beyond the clubs and the radio waves. Fashion adapted to the rhythms of the music. Dresses shortened to allow for freer movement, shoes were designed for dancing, and hairstyles became practical for long nights on the floor. The image of the flapper, with her bobbed hair and swinging beads, was inseparable from the world of jazz. Her very style seemed to echo the syncopation of the music, a visual representation of its energy. Even literature and art caught the spirit. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald captured the mood of the jazz age, while painters and photographers sought to freeze its motion in still images. Jazz was not only sound, it was inspiration, a cultural force that spilled into every corner of American life. By the end of the decade, there was hardly a community untouched by it. Schools organized jazz bands, parades included jazz ensembles, and national magazines published spreads on the latest dances. The music that had once been dismissed by critics as wild or dangerous had become the defining sound of an era. And through it all, the stars of jazz continued to shine, their names etched into memory, their songs etched into hearts. Audiences did not just listen. They lived through the music, carrying it into their own stories, their own lives. Jazz had become more than a sound. It had become a way of being. As the 1920s neared its close, the world hummed with this rhythm. Even as uncertainty loomed on the horizon, the decade's music offered something enduring, the reminder that joy, once found, could not easily be silenced. And so the notes lingered, in dance halls, on records, in the memories of all who had swayed to the beat. By the late 1920s, jazz was no longer merely a new form of music. It was a cultural force reshaping how Americans thought about themselves and their world. It had seeped into language, fashion, social gatherings, and even the imagination of the future. To speak of the jazz age was to speak not only of sound but of identity, a rhythm that defined a generation. For young people, jazz became a marker of modernity. It was more than entertainment. It was a declaration of belonging to the present, of stepping away from the traditions of their parents and grandparents. To dance the Charleston, to sway with a partner to the notes of a saxophone, to hum a Louis Armstrong tune while walking home at night, these were gestures of participation in a world that felt faster, freer, and more daring than the one before. Jazz gave young men and women a sense that they were part of something new, something bigger than themselves, a culture that reached from Harlem to Hollywood, from the crowded dance halls of Chicago to the quiet parlors of small towns. For women especially, jazz became a soundtrack to independence. Track to independence. The flapper was inseparable from jazz. Her short hair, short dresses, and carefree movements mirrored the syncopated rhythms of the music. Where once women had been bound by stiff corsets and social expectations of quiet decorum, now they were laughing, smoking, drinking, and dancing with abandon. Jazz did not create this shift, but it gave it a pulse, a soundtrack that celebrated liberation. Each trumpet note seemed to cheer for her freedom, each piano riff echoing the joy of her rebellion. For African American communities, jazz was both pride and paradox. Fulpride and paradox. It was born of their traditions, their struggles, their creativity, yet it was often consumed by audiences who failed to recognize its roots. Musicians like Armstrong, Ellington, and Smith became stars, but racism still shaped their lives and opportunities. Still, the music carried an undeniable power. It demanded to be heard, and in being heard, it forced recognition of the brilliance and artistry of black culture. Jazz blurred boundaries, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in dramatic ones. On the dance floor, in the shared space of rhythm and movement, divisions weakened, even if only for a night. The music also transformed how Americans thought about time itself. Before jazz, much of popular music followed predictable patterns, rhythms easy to anticipate, melodies that stayed within familiar lines. Jazz broke those rules. Syncopation shifted accents, improvisation made each performance unpredictable. To listen to jazz was to live in the present moment, never certain what the next note would bring. This mirrored the mood of the 1920s itself, a decade of experimentation, risk-taking, and rapid change. In a sense, jazz became the perfect soundtrack for a society learning to embrace uncertainty. Radio helped amplify this identity. Families in rural America could tune in and hear the same songs as dancers in New York or Chicago. This created a shared cultural landscape where people separated by geography could feel connected by the same melodies. Jazz became part of the national conversation, woven into jokes, slang, and everyday references. The country, vast and varied as it was, suddenly had a common rhythm. Even critics who disapproved of jazz unwittingly strengthened its role in shaping identity. Clergy and social commentators warned of its supposed dangers, calling it immoral, reckless, even un-American. Yet their warnings often made the music more alluring. For young listeners, embracing jazz became a subtle act of rebellion, a way to declare independence from authority. To be accused of being a moderner or Ewald Wald, for many a badge of honour. Jazz became not only sound but symbol, the music of those who dared to live differently. The legacy of jazz was not confined to America. Touring bands carried it overseas where audiences in Europe embraced it with enthusiasm. Paris in particular fell in love with jazz, its cafes and clubs resounding with the same rhythms heard in Harlem. Writers like Ernest Hemingway and artists like Pablo Picasso found themselves drawn into the orbit of jazz, its energy sparking their own creativity. The music crossed oceans as easily as it crossed city streets, and in doing so, it reshaped global culture. As the decade winged toward its close, the music only grew more influential. By 1929, big bands were rising, swing was beginning to emerge, and jazz was settling into a place of permanence rather than novelty. And what's been dismissed as noisy experimentation was now celebrated as artistry. Colleges began to form jazz ensembles, composers studied its techniques, and even the most skeptical critics could no longer deny its power. The legacy it left behind was layered. Jazz gave Americans new ways to express joy, sorrow, and desire, gave young people a soundtrack for independence, women a rhythm for liberation, and black artists a platform for brilliance. It blurred boundaries of race and class, even if imperfectly, and it created a shared cultural identity across a vast nation. Most of all, it left memories, nights of dancing, afternoons of listening, mornings of humming a tune that still lingered. When people of the 1930s looked back at the roaring 20s, jazz was among the first things they remembered. It was inseparable from the image of the decade, a sound that echoed long after the parties ended. Even as the Great Depression reshaped the nation, the memory of jazz reminded people of a time when life had felt lighter, freer and full of possibility. Jazz did not end with the 1920s, it only grew, transforming into new styles, inspiring new generations. But the jazz age itself was unique, a moment when music, identity and history aligned. The decade danced to a rhythm that could never be fully repeated, only remembered, like the lingering notes of a song fading into silence. And so, as the curtain fell on the decade, jazz remained in the air. In records stacked on shelves, in memories of late-night dances, in the very language people spoke. It was not simply music. It was the sound of an age, the soundtrack of freedom, the heartbeat of the roaring 20s. The decade that danced to jazz also carried a shadow. By day, life in the 1920s looked open and bright. Bustling streets, polished cars, baseball games, and crowded theatres. But when night fell, another story unfolded, one written in whispers, passwords, and the clink of glasses hidden from the law. This was the world of prohibition, a grand social experiment that, instead of erasing alcohol, gave birth to an underground culture of speakeasies, smuggling, and secret joy. Yay! The story began in 1920, when the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcohol in the United States. The idea, at least on paper, was noble. To cure the nation of its drinking problem, to strengthen families, to reduce crime, and to promote morality. For decades, reformers had warned that alcohol was tearing households apart and draining communities of their strength. Churches, civic groups, and political leaders joined together, believing they could reshape society through a ban on liquor. But almost from the start, reality twisted the dream. America was too vast, too restless, too inventive to simply stop drinking. Instead of vanishing, alcohol slipped underground, carried in barrels across borders, brewed in bathtubs, and poured behind doors that locked to the sound of a knock. What was meant to purify society only pushed indulgence into the shadows, and in the process it reshaped leisure itself. The speakeasy became the symbol of this new world. At first they were modest, hidden rooms behind shops or restaurants, places where trusted customers might be allowed to sip whiskey or gin. But as the decade rolled on, they grew grander, more daring. In New York, Chicago, and countless other cities, entire clubs thrived in defiance of the law. A visitor might enter through an unmarked door, whisper a password to a doorman, and suddenly find themselves in a glittering room filled with music, dancing, and laughter. Inside, the atmosphere often felt freer than in the legal saloons of the past. Because these places were already operating in secret, rules of decorum were looser. Men and women mingled more easily, and women especially found new spaces to express independence. Speakeasy was one of the few places where a woman might walk in alone without raising eyebrows, order a drink, and dance into the night. In that way, prohibition, ironically, opened doors for liberation. The drinks themselves told part of the story. With high-quality liquor scarce, bartenders became inventive. Gin was often mixed with fruit juice to mask its harsh taste, giving rise to cocktails like the Gin, Ricky, and the Sidecar. Rum runners smuggled spirits from the Caribbean, Canadian whiskey crossed the northern border, and moonshine poured from hidden stills in rural valleys. Every sip carried a hint of danger, but also a thrill. To drink during Prohibition was not only about alcohol, it was about defiance, about joining a hidden ritual that bonded people together. Music was the lifeblood of these secret spaces. Jazz, already the sound of the decade, flourished in speakeasies. A smoky room filled with trumpets and saxophones felt alive with rebellion. Couples danced cheek to cheek, the notes of Armstrong or Ellington soaring above them, while waiters weaved between tables carrying trays of glasses that glistened in low light. The combination of forbidden drink and forbidden rhythms gave the nights a charge of electricity that could not be found in any legal establishment. For many, the speakeasy was more than a place to drink. It was a stage where new identities could be tried on. A factory worker might rub shoulders with a banker, a housewife with a Broadway actress, a young man with a famous boxer. The mingling of classes, so rare in daylight, seemed natural under the spell of secrecy. People came not only for alcohol, but for belonging, for the chance to be part of a hidden society that felt more alive than the ordinary world. Yet outside the doors, the tension of prohibition was real. Federal agents raided clubs, smashing barrels and arresting owners. Newspapers carried stories of raids gone wrong, of speakeasies reopening the very next night, of agents bribed to look the other way. The cat-and-mouse game between law enforcement and revelers only added to the allure. To enter a speakeasy was to risk discovery, and that risk made the laughter inside all the sweeter. By the mid-1920s, prohibition had unintentionally created an entire underground economy. Bootleggers grew wealthy supplying clubs, mobsters organized vast networks of smuggling, and crime families rose to power on the profits of illegal liquor. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago became infamous, their names whispered in both fear and fascination. For ordinary citizens, this underworld remained mostly invisible, yet its shadow touched every glass raised in a hidden bar. Still, the nightly reality for most visitors was simpler. A dim room, a crowded table, a saxophone's wail, and the warmth of drink shared among friends. It was here that Americans learned to savor cocktails, to delight in jazz, to flirt and laugh in ways that felt unrestrained. In a strange twist, the very law meant to suppress leisure ended up shaping it, giving the decade a secret pulse that beat just beneath the surface. And so, when people remembered the 1920s, they did not only recall the cars, the radios, or the ball games. They remembered the knock at the hidden door, the whispered password, the moment the curtain pulled back to reveal a world of light, music, and forbidden joy. For a decade that thrived on contrasts, freedom and restriction, noise and silence, innocence and rebellion, the speakeasy stood as its most perfect symbol. If you closed your eyes in a speakeasy in the middle of the 1920s, you might have believed you were safe. The laughter was thick, the music wild, the glasses clinking as though nothing in the world could touch the joy of the moment. But outside those smoke-filled rooms, forces far larger than a night's entertainment were gathering. The prohibition laws meant to cleanse society had instead fed a machine of crime so powerful it reshaped America itself. At the heart of this new world was bootlegging, the illegal manufacture, transport and sale of alcohol. In rural fields and hidden basements, moonshine was distilled by farmers who knew how to make corn into whiskey long before the law forbade it. Along coastlines, daring captains ferried barrels of rum from the Caribbean under cover of darkness. Across the Canadian border, trucks rolled south, their cargo hidden beneath crates of fruit or bundles of cloth. The trade was dangerous, but it was also wildly profitable. And profit drew the attention of those most willing to bend the rules. Gangsters. Organised crime had existed before Prohibition, but the ban on alcohol gave it a new foundation, a steady stream of money that could be counted on as long as Americans wanted to drink. Which, as it turned out, was always. In Chicago, New York, Detroit, and smaller cities too, networks of smugglers, distributors, and enforcers sprang up almost overnight. The figures who ran them became household names, half feared and half admired, the dark celebrities of the decade. No name loomed larger than Al Capone, the scar-faced mob boss of Chicago. To many, he was the face of Prohibition's failure. His empire stretched across the city, supplying thousands of speakeasies with beer and whiskey, protected by bribed police officers and politicians who looked the other way. Newspapers splashed his exploits on front pages, making him both a villain and a folk hero. He lived lavishly, throwing parties that mirrored the very decadence of the era, even as his organisation left trails of violence in the streets. But Capone was not alone. In New York, rival gangs battled over control of speakeasies in Harlem and Lower Manhattan. In Detroit, smuggling across the Canadian border turned the city into a hub of illegal trade. In smaller towns, local bosses and crime families built their own little kingdoms, controlling who drank, who sold, and who dared to oppose them. The country that had once imagined temperance as a moral shield was now discovering that Prohibition had instead built an empire of shadows. For the ordinary drinker, though, this empire existed only at the edges of awareness. They did not see the bloodshed in alleys or the corruption behind closed doors. They saw only the results. The glass filled at their table, the music that swelled as they danced, the thrill of knowing they were part of something forbidden. Bootleggers and gangsters became invisible hosts of leisure, supplying the drinks that kept the nights alive. Still, the glamour of the speakeasy carried with it an undeniable danger. Raids by federal agents were unpredictable, and though many were staged more for show than for success, they left behind broken bottles, smashed furniture, and frightened crowds. There was always a risk of being caught, fined, or even jailed. Yet for some, that risk was part of the appeal. Drinking under prohibition was not only a pleasure, but an act of rebellion, and rebellion carries its own intoxication. The violence of the underworld, however, could not always be ignored. Windsor. Rival gangs fought openly for control of territory, their wars spilling into city streets. The most infamous of these clashes came in 1929 at the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago, when 7 men linked to one gang were gunned down by Capone's rivals. Though such brutality shocked the public, it also underscored how deeply prohibition had warped the country's idea of law and order. The very amendment meant to reduce crime had instead made murder headlines a regular feature of urban life. And yet, in the paradoxical way of the 1920s, this danger only seemed to heighten the decade's sense of thrill. Stories of gangsters, raids and smuggling routes filled the newspapers. People followed them as they might follow a serialized novel, turning criminals into strange figures of fascination. Some were seen as modern-day outlaws, breaking unjust laws in pursuit of freedom, while others were feared as ruthless men who held entire neighborhoods in their grip. Either way, crime became part of the mythology of the Roaring Twenties, inseparable from the jazz and the cocktails that defined its nights. Behind the danger was also ingenuity. Bootleggers developed clever methods to outwit authorities. Cars were modified with hidden compartments, engines tuned for high-speed chases along country roads. Smugglers along the coasts used fast boats that could outrun Coast Guard patrols. In cities, entire networks of tunnels and false walls hid barrels of liquor. A customer in a speakeasy might never know that the bottle on their table had travelled across borders, down rivers, and through a labyrinth of secret passageways before reaching their glass. The cocktail, too, was born of this ingenuity. Because much of the liquor was poorly made or harsh to drink on its own, bartenders turned to mixing, adding juices, syrups, and bitters to disguise the flavour. Out of necessity came creativity, and the era gave birth to drinks that remain classics today. A sip of a sidecar or a bee's knees carried with it not only the taste of gin or brandy, but the ingenuity of survival, the artistry of turning scarcity into style. The social fabric of speakeasies reflected this same blend of danger and glamour. To enter, one had to know someone, to be trusted enough to be given a password. This exclusivity gave the places an aura of mystery, a sense of belonging to a hidden club. Yet once inside, barriers often broke down. Men and women, rich and poor, sat side by side, united by the thrill of the forbidden. It was, in its own way, a democratization of pleasure. The idea that in the face of law, everyone who dared to enter became equal. And through it all, the speakeasy remained the heartbeat of nightlife. Jazz musicians thrived, their careers fueled by the steady demand for live music in clubs that never seemed to close. Dancers tested new styles, from the Charleston to the shimmy, their movements wild, defiant, almost mocking the very idea of restraint. For many, these nights were more than entertainment. They were a way of stepping outside the strict lines of ordinary life, of tasting freedom in a glass and in a song. By the late 1920s, it was clear to almost everyone that prohibition had failed to achieve its promise. Instead of a sober, moral nation, America had become a land of hidden bottles, secret doors, and gangster empires. And yet, despite the chaos, the era had also given people something they would never forget: the thrill of belonging to a secret world, the taste of rebellion mixed with gin and jazz. When people looked back, they remembered both the glitter and the danger. They remembered the thrill of knocking on an unmarked door, the way the music wrapped around them as they entered, and the way the first sip of forbidden liquor seemed to make the whole room brighter. They remembered, too, the headlines, the shootouts, the raids. Together, these memories formed the strange dual legacy of Prohibition, a time when America tried to turn away from drink, and in doing so, taught itself how intoxicating rebellion could be. By the late 1920s, Prohibition was no longer simply a law. It had become a way of life, a shadow woven into the very fabric of the decade. Its reach extended beyond the glasses raised in speakeasies or the barrels smuggled across borders. It reshaped who people were, how they behaved, how they dressed, and even how they spoke. The attempt to erase alcohol had instead coloured nearly every corner of American culture. One of the most striking changes unfolded in the realm of gender roles. Before Prohibition, saloons had been largely male spaces, rough-hewn establishments where women rarely ventured except under duress. But the rise of the speakeasy cracked that divide. These hidden clubs welcomed women not as outliers, but as central participants in the nightly ritual. For the first time, it became normal for a young woman to walk into a bar, order a drink, and claim the same social space as a man. This newfound visibility fed into the broader transformation of the 1920s woman, the flapper. With her bobbed hair, short dresses, and daring lipstick, the flapper embodied a spirit of independence that shocked older generations. She smoked cigarettes in public, danced the Charleston until dawn, and raised a cocktail glass without shame. Though not every woman lived this way, the image of the flapper became an icon of the decade, and Prohibition had provided the stage on which she performed. Fashion itself seemed to evolve in harmony with the hidden nightlife. Dresses grew looser and shorter, designed not for modesty but for movement on crowded dance floors. Sequins and beads shimmered under dim speakeasy lights, catching the rhythm of jazz. Men, too, shifted their style. The tailored suit, the fedora, and the slicked-back hair of the era carried with them a sense of urban polish, the look of someone who might just slip through a secret door after dark. Even accessories, a flask hidden in a jacket, a cigarette case polished to gleam, became symbols of sophistication and daring. Language was no less transformed. Prohibition birthed a whole vocabulary of its own. Words like a bootlegger, a moonshine, and a speakeasy slipped into everyday conversation. Slang flourished. A drink was a giggle water, a speakeasy might be called a juice joint, and those who opposed Prohibition were wets, while its defenders were dries. To talk about leisure in the 1920s was to speak a new dialect shaped by secrecy, rebellion, and playfulness. At the same time, Prohibition created strange contradictions in public life. On paper, the law was meant to uphold morality, but in practice, it often produced the opposite. Judges, policemen, and politicians who were supposed to enforce the rules were frequently found drinking themselves or taking bribes from bootleggers. Ordinary citizens, too, lived in quiet hypocrisy, condemning alcohol by day and sipping it by night. The law blurred the line between honesty and dishonesty, making it feel almost ordinary to bend the truth. This hypocrisy wore down public patience. By the late 1920s, the cracks in Prohibition's foundation were too large to ignore. Enforcement was expensive, uneven, and often corrupt. The government lost enormous amounts of potential tax revenue while organised crime grew rich and violent. The social experiment that had begun with such optimism was now widely regarded as a failure. Newspapers ran stories of deaths from poisonous homemade liquor, of gangland murders, of communities worn thin by the endless battle between law and leisure. Yet, even in its failure, Prohibition had left behind cultural shifts that would not be undone. The integration of women into nightlife remained, as did the cocktail culture that had blossomed from necessity. The idea of social drinking as part of modern life had been cemented, even celebrated. America might have outlawed the bottle, but it had inadvertently taught itself how to drink in new, more stylish, and more inclusive ways. The pressure for repeal grew louder as the decade waned. Civic groups, politicians, and ordinary citizens began calling for change. The stock market crash of 1929 only accelerated the push. Suddenly, the government was desperate for revenue, and the prospect of taxing alcohol once again seemed like a lifeline. By then, the mood of the country had shifted. The glamour of secret rebellion no longer outweighed the costs of crime, corruption, and lost income. Still, in the memory of those who lived through it, Prohibition retained a strange glow. People remembered the thrill of slipping through a hidden door, of whispering a password, of stepping into a room alive with music and light. They remembered the taste of cocktails that mixed danger with delight, the sight of women dancing with newfound freedom, the hum of jazz carried on smoke-filled air. They remembered, too, the way language, fashion, and identity had been reshaped by the very law meant to erase indulgence. By the time repeal finally came in 1933, the world had changed. The Great Depression had cast a shadow far darker than Prohibition ever had, and the carefree nights of the 1920s were gone. Yet the legacy of those years endured. The speakeasies closed their doors, but cocktails remained. Gangsters faded or fell, but the myths around them lived on. Women did not retreat to the margins of social life, and jazz never stopped playing. In hindsight, prohibition was less about banning alcohol than about revealing the American spirit, resilient, rebellious, inventive, and endlessly drawn to pleasure. It showed that leisure could not be legislated away, that joy finds its path even through locked doors and whispered codes. And so, when people thought of the roaring 20s, they did not only think of jazz or flappers, of radios or automobiles. They thought too of the hidden world behind unmarked doors, where a nation discovered that even in restraint it could dance, drink and dream. The streets of the 1920s did not only echo with the sounds of music and engines, they also shouted with images, posters and slogans. For the first time in American history, free time was being shaped not only by personal choice, but by carefully crafted messages that promised happiness in exchange for purchase. Billboards loomed above highways, glossy magazines filled coffee tables, and the voices on the radio carried jingles straight into people's homes. Advertising became the silent companion of leisure, guiding how people dressed, what they ate, where they travelled, and even how they dreamed. So, this transformation was no accident. The end of the Great War had brought both prosperity and a flood of new technologies. Factories that once made weapons turned their machines toward producing cars, radios, cosmetics and appliances. The problem was no longer supply, it was demand. To keep the wheels of industry turning, Americans had to be convinced not just to buy, but to buy constantly. And so, advertising grew into a force more powerful than ever before. In magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Saturday Evening Post, colourful ads showed women smiling as they stood beside gleaming washing machines or vacuum cleaners. The message was clear: modern appliances didn't just clean your home, they gave you freedom, time and dignity. For women who had spent endless hours on chores, the appeal was irresistible. The product was not simply an object, it was a promise of leisure. For men, advertisements leaned toward cars, razors, suits and cigarettes. A man in a Ford or Chevrolet was not only driving, he was living proof of success. A man who smoked a particular brand of cigarette wasn't simply enjoying tobacco, he was stylish, worldly, desirable. The ads wrapped products in layers of meaning until to buy something was not only to spend money, but to shape identity. Billboards along the highways reflected this new world of persuasion. They showed smiling families in automobiles, picnic baskets full of packaged goods, women in elegant dresses holding perfume bottles. As cars carried Americans further than ever before, the landscape itself became an advertising canvas. Leisure was no longer only about what you did, but what you bought along the way. The rise of celebrity endorsements also transformed consumer life. Film stars like Clara Bow and Rudolph Valentino appeared in ads for cosmetics, clothing, and even laxatives. Athletes, too, lent their names to products, tying physical strength or skill to the objects on store shelves. When Babe Ruth appeared in ads for candy bars or breakfast cereal, he wasn't just selling food. He was selling the dream of success, the thrill of being larger than life. Perhaps the most powerful shift came with radio advertising. At first, radio had been a marvel, a way to hear voices and music from far away. But soon, companies realised they could use it to speak directly to millions of households at once. Short, catchy jingles slipped into living rooms, carried by the same airwaves that brought sermons, speeches and symphonies. Unlike a billboard, a radio ad entered the intimate space of family life. It was persuasive not only because it was constant, but because it felt like part of the very rhythm of leisure itself. Consumer credit, too, fueled the cycle. For the first time, ordinary people could buy products on installment plans, paying a little at a time. Advertisers encouraged this practice, framing it not as debt but as progress. Why wait for luxury, they asked, when you could have it now? A new car, a new radio, a fashionable dress, all could be yours immediately, as long as you promised the future in small payments. Leisure became tied not only to products, but to the promise of tomorrow. In homes across the nation, the shift was unmistakable. A family gathering in the evening might listen to a radio program sponsored by a soap company, flip through a magazine filled with glossy ads, or drive to a picnic with goods bought because a billboard had caught their eye. Advertising was no longer a background detail. It was a force that shaped how people imagined fun, freedom, and even happiness itself. And yet, for all its brightness, consumer culture carried subtle shadows. It promised leisure but also demanded conformity. To be modern, stylish, or free often meant buying the right brand, wearing the right clothes, owning the right gadgets. Leisure, once shaped by community and tradition, was increasingly guided by the marketplace. Some critics saw this as a loss, a surrender of individuality to the loud voices of commerce. But for many Americans in the 1920s, it felt like liberation. To buy was to participate in modern life, to join the great dance of the Roaring Twenties. So the decade unfolded under the twin lights of neon signs and magazine gloss. A walk through the city was a walk through slogans and images, each promising a brighter, easier, more joyful life. A drive along the highway became a journey through painted promises. And in the quiet of a living room, a radio voice told families that leisure was only one purchase away. Advertising did not merely sell products, it sold dreams. And in the 1920s, those dreams shimmered with the same restless energy as jazz, cars, and speakeasies, bright, alluring, and just within reach. If you were to sit in a living room in 1926 with the radio crackling to life in the corner, the sound that drifted across the room might not be only a violin or a newscaster's voice. It might be a cheerful little rhyme sung brightly, promising that your laundry would be whiter, your stomach lighter, or your evenings brighter, all for just a few cents at the store. It was the age of the jingle, and it transformed advertising from an image on a page to a song that lived in your head, humming along with daily life. The 1920s were a golden age for specific brands that would become household names for generations. Ivory soap, for example, had been around since the late 1800s, but its advertising campaigns reached new heights during this decade. Its famous slogan, "It floats," was more than a promise of purity. It was a playful fact that captured the imagination. Mothers were told it was safer for their children. Modern households were reminded it was scientifically clean, and in glossy magazines, drawings showed bright, happy families using the product. A simple bar of soap became an emblem of progress, of belonging to the new American middle class. Cigarettes, too, were transformed by advertising. Before the 1920s, smoking had been seen largely as a male habit, even slightly disreputable. But ad campaigns began to target women directly, presenting smoking as glamorous, sophisticated, even liberating. Lucky Strike's slogan, "Reach for a lucky instead of a sweet," suggested that cigarettes were not only stylish but also a way to stay slim. Suddenly, smoking was tied to modern femininity, reinforcing the image of the daring flapper with her cocktail in one hand and cigarette in the other. It was not just a product being sold, it was an identity, an invitation to participate in the rhythm of modern life. Coca-Cola, too, solidified its place in the leisure landscape of the 1920s. Already popular, the brand positioned itself as not merely a refreshment, but a companion to fun, relaxation, and sociability. Ads showed young men and women laughing around soda fountains, couples sharing bottles during picnics, families smiling together on hot summer afternoons. Coca-Cola was not selling a drink. It was selling togetherness, joy, and the very idea of leisure as a sweet, fizzy experience. Another cornerstone of the advertising boom was the rise of radio jingles. One of the earliest and most famous was for Wheaties cereal. In 1926, General Mills debuted what is often called the first singing commercial. "Have you tried Wheaties?" Sung by a male quartet, it turned a breakfast food into a melody that stuck in the mind long after the radio was turned off. The effect was powerful. Sales of Wheaties, which had been faltering, skyrocketed. The jingle had done what no static advertisement could. It had embedded itself into memory, into daily life, into the act of waking up each morning. Products that once felt purely practical were suddenly wrapped in emotional narratives. Toothpaste was no longer about clean teeth. It was about confidence in conversation, romance, and social success. Automobiles were not about transport, but about freedom, adventure, and status. Cosmetics were not only about colour or skin, but about daring, modern self-expression. A tube of lipstick or a bottle of perfume could make you, for a moment, feel as if you belonged to the glittering world of Hollywood or the thrill of the speakeasy. The connection between advertising and identity was perhaps the most profound shift of the decade. Before the 1920s, leisure had been shaped more by community traditions, church gatherings, neighborhood festivals, porch conversations. But now advertisers spoke directly to the individual, whispering that you could define yourself by what you bought. Were you modern? By the latest radio. Were you stylish? Wear the advertised dress. Were you youthful? Smoke the right cigarette. Were you successful? Drive the right car. Even children were not immune. Brands began to target young audiences with candy bars, toys and cereals, tying childhood joy to products that could be bought in shiny packages. The idea that happiness could be wrapped, sold and carried home in a bag was a new form of persuasion that would only grow stronger in the decades ahead. Magazines became playgrounds for advertisers, their glossy pages filled with full-colour illustrations. Artists like Norman Rockwell contributed to ads that blended artistry with persuasion, making them as visually delightful as they were persuasive. The beauty of the ad became part of its allure. A painting of a smiling family at Christmas, surrounded by branded goods, was both comforting and convincing. Leisure itself was pictured on the page, waiting to be purchased. Critics of the era were quick to point out the deeper currents. Some argued that advertising created false needs, that it turned ordinary people into consumers chasing an endless horizon of products. Social critics worried that the constant bombardment of slogans and jingles blurred the line between real happiness and purchased illusion. But for most Americans, these concerns remained distant. The promises felt too alluring, too bright, too in tune with the hopeful rhythm of the roaring 20s. Advertising also blurred the boundary between leisure and labor. A man who drove a shiny new car or wore a well-advertised suit was not just relaxing. He was displaying his success at work, his place in the world. A woman who wore the latest perfume or owned an electric washing machine was not just enjoying leisure. She was signalling that she too belonged to the forward march of modernity. Products were no longer simply tools or toys. They were social markers, badges of belonging to an age of progress. In the neon-lit cities, the effect was unmistakable. Walking down Broadway at night, one was surrounded by signs flashing brand names, glowing promises, glowing futures. The city itself became a theatre of advertising, and each passerby was both an audience member and a participant. Even in small towns, shop windows carried echoes of the same campaigns, tying rural life into the wider fabric of national consumer culture. By the close of the decade, advertising had succeeded in something extraordinary. It had not only filled shelves and pockets, but it had also filled imaginations. It had convinced Americans that leisure was not only about what you did, but about what you owned, and that to own was to become. By the mid-1920s, advertising had moved beyond catchy phrases and bright pictures. It had begun to borrow something more subtle, more powerful, the insights of modern psychology. No longer was it enough to show a product and describe what it did. Now, advertisers sought to slip into the mind of the consumer, to stir feelings, desires, even anxieties that would guide choices without a second thought. The work of psychologists like John B. Watson, who had once been a pioneer in behavioral science, found its way into the world of advertising. Instead of asking, "What does this product do?" campaigns began to ask, "How can this product make someone feel?" Soap was linked to romance, deodorant to social acceptance, cars to freedom, radios to family bonding. Ads didn't just sell goods. They sold reassurance, belonging, status, and escape. The genius of this psychological turn was in recognizing that modern life, busy and shifting, left people with insecurities. The world was moving faster than ever before, and with it came questions about identity. Was one modern enough, stylish enough, healthy enough, happy enough? Advertisers stepped in with confident answers. Yes, if you buy this, a slogan or a picture could soothe the worry, promise transformation, or quietly suggest that without this purchase, one might fall behind. The rise of credit made these promises even more tempting. Before the 1920s, buying on installment plans had been rare, reserved mostly for big items like sewing machines or pianos. But in this decade, credit spread widely. Automobiles could be purchased with small monthly payments. Radios, furniture, refrigerators, even clothing could be bought on time. Suddenly, leisure and comfort were no longer limited to what one could afford immediately. They could be borrowed from the future, brought into the present with a signature and a promise. This was a profound shift. Advertising, psychology, and credit together reshaped the rhythm of leisure. A family that once might have waited years to afford a radio could now have one within weeks. A young couple might buy a car and drive out to the countryside long before they could truly pay for it. A woman could enjoy the latest fashions without saving for months. Leisure was democratized, but also tethered to debt, to a constant cycle of buying and paying, desiring and owing. Advertising didn't just reflect these new realities, it accelerated them. Campaigns explicitly encouraged the idea that life was too short to wait, that joy should be grasped now. A why delay happiness? A one ad asked. Bring the modern world into your home today. The suggestion was both liberating and binding. Leisure was at your fingertips, but always at a price, always carrying the promise of future payments. The cultural effects rippled outward. Neighbours judged one another not only by their manners or their gardens, but by their possessions. Did the family across the street have a phonograph? Did they wear the right brands, drive the right car, entertain with the right cocktails? Advertising fed this quiet social competition, framing products as not just useful but essential markers of belonging. To own was not only to enjoy, it was to be seen as modern, respectable, successful. Leisure itself in this context became something more complicated. It was no longer just time away from work, fishing at a pond, walking through town, telling stories by the fire. Leisure was increasingly tied to consumption. To relax meant to go to the movies, to listen to the radio, to drive in the car, to enjoy products and experiences made possible by advertising. Free time became branded time, wrapped in the jingles, slogans, and glossy images of the decade. The language of advertising also reshaped how Americans talked about themselves. Phrases from ads slipped into everyday conversation. Slogans became shorthand for aspirations. To say, "I only smoke," or "it floats," was to echo the language of the magazines and the radio. The border between commercial speech and personal identity blurred, as if life itself were an extension of the ad pages. Yet beneath the glitter, there were shadows. Some critics feared that advertising and credit created a fragile culture of illusion. If leisure was built on purchases and purchases on debt, what would happen if the cycle broke? A few voices warned of instability, hinting at a coming crash, though most ignored them in the brightness of the moment. The rhythm of ads was too cheerful, too insistent. Buy now, enjoy now, live now, live now. The future seemed distant, softened by the glow of neon and the sweetness of soda fountains. Still, for ordinary families, the changes were undeniable. A house filled with small luxuries, a radio humming in the parlour, a refrigerator keeping milk cool, a phonograph spinning records. Felt like progress, felt like joy. The act of buying became its own form of leisure, a weekend pastime of browsing stores, flipping through catalogues, or admiring window displays. Shopping was no longer only about need, it was about experience, about imagining oneself in the shining world pictured in ads. This transformation left a permanent imprint. Leisure in the 1920s was not just shaped by advertising, it was defined by it. Every picnic could include branded soda. Every radio night carried jingles alongside songs. Every car ride was both a trip and a display. The very definition of free time shifted from moments lived to moments purchased, from shared traditions to shared consumption. By the end of the decade, the pattern was set. The crash of 1929 would shake the system, strip away some of the glitter, and leave many debts unpaid. Yet the cultural shift endured. Advertising had done more than sell products. It had redrawn the landscape of American leisure. It had planted the idea that joy, identity, and belonging could be bought, that to participate in modern life was to consume, and that free time itself was a stage on which brands played as brightly as jazz bands or Hollywood films. In the quiet of a 1920s evening, with a family gathered around the radio, a box of cookies on the table, and the glow of a neon sign outside the window, one could sense it. Leisure had been forever changed. The soundscape, the sights, the very imagination of what it meant to live well, all carried the fingerprints of advertising. And though the slogans might fade and the jingles be forgotten, the habit they nurtured would remain, pulsing softly through the decades to come. The Roaring Twenties had been a decade of rhythm, invention, brightness, and escape. Each chapter of free time we have drifted through, The jazz halls, the movie palaces, the radios humming in living rooms, the cars speeding down open roads painted a picture of an America that was discovering itself anew. For a moment, it seemed as though leisure could stretch endlessly, a river of laughter, music, and light that would carry everyone forward into a modern world. But time has a way of folding shadows into even the brightest scenes. By the final years of the decade, cracks were forming beneath the glitter. The same advertising that had urged people to buy freely, the same credit that had made leisure instantly available, the same stock market euphoria that had promised endless growth, all of these forces combined were quietly setting the stage for collapse. For ordinary families, the shift came gently at first. A missed payment on a car, a radio installment that felt heavy one month, a storekeeper who hesitated before offering more credit. And then, in the fall of 1929, the storm broke. Storm broke. The stock market crashed, and with it, the fragile scaffolding of easy prosperity tumbled down. Leisure, which had felt like a birthright of the modern age, suddenly became a luxury again. Movie palaces still showed films, but fewer people could afford tickets. Automobiles still rolled down highways, but some sat idle for lack of gasoline money. Jazz still played, but sometimes it played in half-empty halls. The Great Depression pressed down on every corner of American life, and the exuberant freedom of the 1920s gave way to the heavy uncertainty of the 1930s. And yet, the story of the Roaring Twenties was not erased. Its rhythms, its inventions, its promises did not vanish when banks closed and factories slowed. Instead, they left a deeper imprint, a memory of what leisure could be, and a blueprint for the future. Radio, for example, remained a centerpiece of American households, even in hard times. Families gathered around it not just for entertainment, but for comfort, for President Roosevelt's fireside chats, for a sense that the nation was still connected. The car, too, remained a symbol of freedom, even when gas was precious and roads led more often to job hunts than to picnics. In a strange way, the Great Depression gave the decade's pleasures new meaning. What had been casual became cherished. A Sunday movie became a rare treat, savoured more deeply. A jazz record, spinning on a phonograph, became not just background music, but a reminder of joy. Even the advertisements, once symbols of endless abundance, now read like relics from a vanished world, promises of happiness that had once felt so close, now seen through the lens of longing. Looking back, the 1920s seemed both like a dream and a foundation. They were a dream in the sense that their speed, their brightness, their confidence seem almost unreal, as if the decade were a long party that history could not sustain. But they were a foundation too, because the very patterns of modern leisure, the way Americans tied identity to products, the way music and movies shaped collective imagination, the way free time became both a private escape and a shared culture, these patterns endured long after the decade itself ended. The legacy of the Roaring Twenties is felt not only in the glitter of old photographs or the warmth of remembered songs, but in the ongoing rhythm of life. Every time a jingle plays on the radio, or a family drives out for a weekend trip, or a new film draws a crowd to the theatre, there is an echo of that first moment when Americans began to understand free time as something modern, something shaped by choice, consumption, and shared wonder. As the 1930s unfolded, leisure took new forms, often quieter, often shaped by constraint. But the memory of the 1920s lingered like a melody. People remembered the laughter of jazz clubs, the glow of neon, the hum of radios. And in that memory was a kind of hope. The idea that joy could return, that the rhythm of leisure, once found, would never be entirely lost. The Roaring Twenties, then, were not only a chapter in history, they were a promise, a reminder that even in a changing, uncertain world, people will always find ways to gather, to play, to dream. Free time, however shaped, remains a canvas on which each generation paints its colours. The 1920s painted theirs in gold and neon, in syncopated beats and flickering screens. And though the paint has faded, the outlines remain, guiding the brushstrokes of every decade that followed. So, as we close this journey, picture again the simple moments. A family on a picnic blanket beside their new car, a couple dancing in a speakeasy, a child laughing at the magic of a silent film. These are the images of leisure in the Roaring Twenties, fleeting, glowing ordinary and extraordinary all at once. They are the story of a nation learning not just how to work, but how to rest, how to play, how to dream together. And in the soft rhythm of memory, they continue to dance. Epilogue, a quiet farewell to the Roaring Twenties, and so our long walk through the Roaring Twenties comes to its quiet end. We have drifted through music halls and movie palaces, lingered in smoky speakeasies and sunny picnic fields, wandered highways that seemed to stretch forever, and rested in living rooms where the glow of a radio brought voices from far away. What we have seen is not only a decade but a rhythm. The rhythm of people learning how to spend their free hours in a world that was suddenly faster, brighter, and more connected than ever before. Some danced until morning, some shopped for new comforts, some listened, some watched, some simply sat still and dreamed. All were part of the same great experiment, discovering what leisure could mean in a modern age. Time, of course, carried the story onward. The Great Depression dimmed many of the lights, and the laughter of the 20s softened into something more restrained. But the echoes never disappeared. Jazz notes lingered in the air. Movie stars continued to smile from silver screens. Advertisements still promised a brighter tomorrow. And families, even in harder years, held on to the memory of what it felt like when free time was full of possibility. Now, as we look back from our own quieter place, the decade feels like a dream you drift through just before sleep. The laughter fades, the music softens, the neon signs dim, and all that remains are the outlines of a car parked under the stars, of a record spinning slowly, of a child gazing wide-eyed at a flickering screen. History has many lessons, but this one is simple and soft. Free time, however it is shaped, is part of what makes us human. In every age, we seek joy, rest, and connection. The Roaring Twenties gave us one bright example, painted in golden shadow, in sound and silence, in both fleeting pleasures and lasting memories. And now, with the story gently told, it is time to close the book. Let the music of that era fade into a hum, let the images drift into mist, and let the rhythm of history settle into stillness. Sleep now in the company of the past. Tomorrow will bring its own hours of leisure, its own story. But tonight, the Roaring Twenties rest quietly like a distant melody carried on the wind.